He built an empire with her blood and called it his own. On the night every wolf in the kingdom knelt to witness their bond sealed forever, Alpha King Rowan Vale destroyed the only woman who never lied to him. This is not a love story. This is a war story. And by the end, you will understand why the most dangerous creature in any kingdom is not the king on the throne, but the woman he was fool enough to betray. Stay until the last word. Hit that like. And drop your city in the comments so I know where my pack is watching from tonight. The torches had been burning since sundown, thousands of them, planted into the frozen earth along the processional road that wound from the lower village all the way up the stone steps to the pinnacle, where the ancient silver monument stood against the sky like a fang torn from the jaw of some long-dead god. The air smelled of pine resin, animal fat, and the particular sharpness that comes before snowfall in the Northern Territories. Celine Ashford stood at the far end of the preparation chamber, alone, and she could hear them out there. The drums, the chanting, the low hum of 10,000 wolves gathered in the valley below the pinnacle, their breath rising in clouds that caught the torchlight and turned gold before vanishing. She pressed her palms flat against the cold stone wall and closed her eyes. Her fingers were shaking, not from fear. She had never been afraid of ceremony. She had survived things that made ceremony look like a children's game. No, her hands trembled because something in her chest, something old and instinctive and buried beneath years of discipline, was screaming at her to run. She did not run. She had never run from anything in her life, and she was not about to start on the night she was supposed to become Luna of the largest wolf territory in the known world. The door behind her opened. Marin, her attendant, stepped inside carrying the ceremonial cloak. It was white wolf pelt lined with silver thread, heavy enough to make a grown warrior stoop. Marin draped it across the stone table and looked at Celine with eyes that held something Celine did not want to name. "They are ready for you," Marin said. "How many?" "More than last year's count. The Eastern clan sent delegations. Even the Harrowfield pack crossed the river." Celine opened her eyes. "Harrowfield hasn't crossed the river in 40 years. They crossed it for this." Celine turned from the wall and looked at the cloak. She ran her thumb along the silver stitching. Someone had spent months on this. Someone whose name she would never know, sitting in a workshop somewhere in the lower quarter, sewing by candlelight, believing they were crafting something sacred. "Marin." "Yes." "Have you seen him tonight?" Marin hesitated. It was a small hesitation, barely a half breath, but Celine had spent 7 years reading the silences between words. She had learned that skill in the war camps, where a misread pause could get you killed. "I saw him at the council terrace 2 hours ago," Marin said carefully. "He was speaking with the elders." "Was he alone?" Another pause, longer this time. "Commander Draven was with him, and a few others I did not recognize." Celine nodded slowly. She picked up the cloak and held it against her body. It was impossibly heavy. She remembered a time when she could not have lifted something like this, back when she was 17 and half-starved, crouching in the mud outside the southern border with nothing but a stolen knife and a burning certainty that she would either find a place in this world or die looking for one. That girl would have laughed at this cloak. That girl would have said, "You are going to wear a dead animal on your shoulders and let a man put a crown on your head and call it destiny." But that girl did not know what Celine knew now. She did not know that sometimes you build something with a person, brick by brick, battle by battle, and after enough years the building becomes more real than either of you. You cannot walk away from it, not because you are weak, because walking away would mean admitting that every brick was a lie. "Help me with this," Celine said. Marin lifted the cloak and settled it across Celine's shoulders. The weight pressed down on her collarbones like hands pushing her toward the earth. "You look like a queen," Marin whispered. "I look like a woman wearing a dead wolf," Celine said. "Let us go." They walked the corridor together in silence. The stone walls of the royal fortress were ancient, built by the first Alpha 300 years ago from granite hauled out of the Ashenmere quarries by wolves in their shifted forms. The walls sweated in winter, and tonight they glistened like the inside of a living throat. Celine's boots echoed on the floor. Each step took her closer to the pinnacle, closer to the ceremony, closer to the moment when the bond between her and Rowan would be sealed in the old way, with blood and oath and moonlight. She should have felt triumphant. 7 years. 7 years of war, of strategy, of standing beside Rowan Vale when everyone else abandoned him or tried to put a blade in his back. She had been there when his father's kingdom collapsed. She had been there when the border clans revolted and the southern territories burned for 3 straight months. She had held maps while he planned campaigns. She had stitched wounds closed with her own hands while arrows flew overhead. She had killed for him, not in the abstract romantic way that songs described. She had driven a blade into a man's neck while he begged and watched the light leave his eyes, and then walked back to the command tent and sat down across from Rowan and said, "It is done." 7 years of that. And tonight was supposed to be the reward, the acknowledgement. The moment the entire Wolf Empire looked at her and said, "Yes, she earned this. She belongs here." So why did her chest feel like it was filling with ice water? They reached the outer courtyard. The noise hit her like a wall, drums pounding in a rhythm that matched her heartbeat, or maybe her heartbeat was matching the drums. She could not tell anymore. Torchlight everywhere, turning the snow-dusted courtyard into a sea of flickering orange. Warriors lined the processional path, standing at attention in their ceremonial armor, their faces painted with the black and silver markings of the Vale clan. Behind them, pressed against the stone railings and spilling down the hillside, the common wolves. Thousands of them. Families. Children sitting on their parents' shoulders. Old men who had seen 3 kings rise and fall. Young women clutching each other's arms and craning their necks to see. Celine walked through them all, and they parted for her, and the sound they made was not quite cheering. It was something deeper, a low rolling growl of recognition that vibrated in her ribs. These people knew her, not the way they knew Rowan, not with the awe and fear reserved for the Alpha King. They knew her the way you know the person who showed up at your village after the southern raids and organized the food distribution and made sure your children did not starve. They knew her because she had done the work that kings considered beneath them. She climbed the stone steps to the pinnacle. 112 steps carved into the mountainside, each one worn smooth by centuries of feet. Halfway up, the wind changed. It came from the north now, carrying the bite of the glacial territories, and it cut through the ceremonial cloak like the fur was paper. Celine gritted her teeth and kept climbing. At the top, the pinnacle opened into a broad stone platform dominated by the silver monument. It was not silver, not really. It was a kind of ore found only in the deep mines beneath the Ashenmere Range, and it had a quality that no blacksmith had ever been able to replicate. It caught light and held it. Even now, with only torchlight and a pale moon behind thin clouds, the monument seemed to glow from within, as if something alive was trapped inside the metal. The elders stood in a semicircle before the monument, 12 of them, robed in black, their faces hidden beneath ceremonial hoods. Behind them, the senior warriors of the inner council. And at the center of it all, standing directly beneath the monument with his back to her, was Rowan Vale. He was tall. That was always the first thing anyone noticed, even people who had known him for years. He stood 6.5 feet with the kind of build that came not from training, but from something genetic and unforgiving, shoulders broad enough to block a doorway, hands that could crush a man's throat without fully closing. His dark hair was pulled back from his face and tied with a leather cord. He wore the black and silver armor of the Alpha King, and in the torchlight, with the monument glowing behind him, he looked exactly like what the song said he was. A god in wolf skin. Celine had stopped believing he was a god a long time ago. She had seen him vomit from exhaustion after a 3-day march. She had seen him weep once, only once, the night his younger brother was found dead in the river with his throat torn open. She had seen him make decisions that cost hundreds of lives and then sit alone in the dark for hours afterward, not sleeping, not speaking, just breathing. He was not a god. He was a man with more power than any man should carry, and he carried it the way all men carry too much weight, badly, with cracks showing in places he thought no one could see. She loved him. Even now, climbing the last steps with that cold feeling spreading through her chest, she loved him. And she hated herself for it, because love should not feel like drowning. Rowan turned as she reached the platform. His eyes found hers across 30 feet of torchlit stone, and for a moment, just a moment, something passed between them that was real. Not performance. Not the careful choreography of 2 people who had learned to play their roles in public. Something raw and frightened and honest. like two animals meeting in the dark and recognizing each other by scent alone. Then it was gone. His jaw tightened, his eyes went flat. The mask slid back into place, and he was the Alpha King again, and she was the woman walking toward him in a dead wolf's skin. "You are late," he said. Not loudly, but on the pinnacle, with the acoustics of the stone and the silence of 10,000 wolves holding their breath below, even a whisper carried. "I am here," she said. "That is what matters." He held her gaze for a beat longer than necessary, then turned back to the elders. "Begin." The eldest of the 12, a wolf named Theron, whose face was so lined with age it looked like cracked leather, stepped forward and raised his hands. The drums below stopped. The silence was so sudden and so total it felt like pressure against the eardrums. "Under the eye of the moon and the witness of the clans," Theron began, his voice carrying down the mountainside like wind through a canyon, "we gather to seal the bond between Alpha and Mate, between King and the one who walks beside him. This is the oldest rite, older than the fortress, older than the borders, older than the names we carry." Celine stood beside Rowan and felt the cold radiating off him. Not physical cold, something else, a distance, a wall she had felt growing between them for months but had refused to name because naming it would make it real. She looked at his profile, the hard line of his jaw, the scar that ran from his left ear to the corner of his mouth, a gift from the Battle of Ashenmere. His eyes, fixed on the monument, reflecting the strange inner light of the ore. He did not look at her. She had noticed that. Over the past several months, he had stopped looking at her the way he used to. In the early years, his gaze had been a physical thing, heavy and constant, tracking her across rooms, finding her in crowds. She used to feel it on her skin like heat. Now when they were in the same room, his eyes slid past her the way water slides past stone, present but untouching. She had told herself it was the pressure of the kingdom, the expansion into the western territories, the tensions with the border clans. She had told herself that powerful men retreat inward when the weight gets heavy, and it was her job to hold the perimeter while he fought whatever battle was raging inside his own skull. She had told herself a lot of things. Theron continued the rite. The words were old, formal, spoken in the ancient tongue that most wolves no longer understood, but recognized the way you recognize the melody of a song your mother sang to you before you could speak. Celine understood them. She had studied the old tongue during the years in the war camps, teaching herself from stolen texts by firelight while others slept. It was one of the many things she had done that no one knew about and no one had asked about. The old words meant, roughly translated, "I bind my blood to yours. I bind my war to yours. I bind my silence to yours. Where you walk, I walk. Where you fall, I fall. Where you end, I end." Beautiful words, terrible words. The kind of words that sound like freedom when you are young and sound like a prison sentence when you are old enough to know what they cost. Theron turned to Rowan. "Alpha King, speak your oath." Rowan opened his mouth, and then he stopped. Celine watched it happen, watched the hesitation move through his body like a tremor, watched his hands close into fists at his sides, watched his throat work as if the words were lodged there, too large to pass. The silence stretched. 1 second, 2, 5. The elders shifted. In the crowd below, a murmur began, low and uncertain, like the first distant rumble of a storm. Rowan's eyes moved, not to Celine, past her. Over her shoulder toward the far edge of the pinnacle platform, where the steps descended into the shadows of the northern approach. Celine felt it before she saw it, a change in his body, a softening, a crack in the mask that she had been trying to find for months. And it was not for her. It was not aimed in her direction. That softening, that involuntary loosening of everything that was locked and guarded and closed, was directed at something behind her. She turned. A woman stood at the top of the northern steps. She was young, perhaps 25, with copper hair that caught the torchlight and skin so pale it looked like it had never seen direct sun. She wore a dark traveling cloak with the hood pushed back, and she stood very still, the way someone stands when they know every eye in the world is about to find them. Celine did not recognize her. She turned back to Rowan. "Who is that?" He did not answer. "Rowan, who is that woman?" His jaw clenched. His eyes were still on the woman at the steps, and the expression on his face was something Celine had never seen before. It was not desire, not exactly. It was something more desperate than that. It was the look of a man who has been holding his breath for so long he has forgotten what air tastes like, and someone has just opened a window. "Not here," he said quietly. "We are in the middle of a ceremony. 10,000 wolves are watching. You will answer me." "Celine, not here." "Then where? When?" "Because I have been standing beside you for 7 years, and you have never once looked at me the way you are looking at her right now." The words came out louder than she intended. They rang off the stone and carried. She saw Theron's head turn, saw the elders stiffen, saw Commander Draven, standing at the edge of the platform with his hand resting on his sword hilt, take a step forward and then stop, uncertain. Rowan finally looked at her, and the thing she saw in his eyes was worse than anger, worse than guilt, worse than contempt. It was exhaustion. The bone-deep, soul-level exhaustion of a man who has been performing for so long he cannot remember who he was before the performance began. "Her name is Lyra," he said. "She is under my protection. That is all you need to know." "That is not all I need to know. That is not even close to all I need to know. I am about to take a blood oath with you. I am about to bind my life to yours in front of every clan in the Empire. I think I am entitled to know why a woman I have never seen is standing on the pinnacle during our ceremony looking at you like she owns something I have been paying for with my own skin for 7 years. You are making a scene. You made the scene, Rowan. You made it the moment you let her walk up those steps." He stepped closer to her. His voice dropped to something barely above a breath. "I did not invite her. She was not supposed to be here tonight. Something happened. I will explain later, but right now I need you to trust me." "Trust you?" "Yes." She stared at him. The torchlight moved across his face, and she saw every line, every scar, every shadow. She saw the face she had memorized through years of war and winter and sleepless nights. She knew this face better than her own. She knew what each muscle did when he lied, when he was afraid, when he was calculating 3 moves ahead of everyone else in the room. He was not lying. Not exactly. But he was not telling the truth either. He was doing the thing he always did. The thing she had forgiven 1,000 times because she told herself it was necessary. It was the burden of command. It was what kings had to do. He was giving her just enough to keep her quiet while keeping everything that mattered locked behind a door she was not allowed to open. "Finish the ceremony," she said. "We will talk after." Something moved across his face. Relief, maybe. Or something colder. He turned back to Theron and nodded. Theron, to his credit, resumed the rite without a flicker of expression. The old wolf had seen worse disruptions in his 112 years. He spoke the binding words again, and Rowan recited his oath, his voice steady now, controlled, the voice of the Alpha King that made warriors kneel and enemies surrender. Celine stood beside him and said her words when her words were required. She spoke the oath she had memorized. She allowed her palm to be cut and pressed against his, the blood mixing, the old ritual completed under the pale eye of the moon. She did all of it with precision and discipline because that was what she had always done. She had always completed the mission, no matter what was breaking inside her. But her eyes kept moving to the edge of the platform. Lyra had not left. She stood in the shadows near the northern steps, half hidden by the stone balustrade, and she watched the ceremony with an expression that Celine would later spend months trying to decode. It was not triumph. It was not jealousy. It was something patient and certain. The expression of someone watching a house burn and knowing exactly when the roof would collapse, because they were the one who lit the match. The ceremony ended. The drums resumed. The crowd below erupted into the traditional howl, 10,000 voices rising into the night sky in a sound that shook the mountain and sent birds scattering from the pines for miles in every direction. It was the sound of an empire affirming its leader, affirming his mate, affirming the bond that was supposed to hold everything together. Celine stood in the center of that sound and felt nothing. The reception followed. It was held in the great hall of the fortress, a cavernous space of black stone and timber beams where wolf pelts hung from the walls and a fire pit the size of a small lake burned in the center. Long tables were laid with food and drink. Warriors sang. Children ran between the legs of adults. The elders sat in their carved chairs and watched everything with the careful, unreadable eyes of men who had survived by never fully trusting anyone. Celine moved through the crowd and accepted congratulations and bowed her head when customs required it and smiled when smiles were expected. She was good at this. She had always been good at this. The performance of normalcy under extreme conditions was a survival skill she had developed long before she met Rowan, back in the years she never spoke about, the years in the South, the years of hunger and violence and the slow, grinding education in what the world actually was beneath its pretty stories. She was looking for Lyra. The woman was not in the Great Hall. Celine checked every corner, every alcove, every shadowed doorway. She found warriors, servants, minor clan leaders drinking too much and talking too loudly. She found Marin near the kitchens and pulled her aside. The woman on the pinnacle, copper hair, dark cloak, where did she go? Marin's face went still. I do not know. You are lying. Celine, do not manage me, Marin. I have known you for 6 years. I know what your face does when you lie. Your left eye tightens. It is tightening right now. Where is she? Marin looked at the floor. I heard she was given quarters in the West Tower. The West Tower. That is the royal wing. Yes. On whose authority? Marin said nothing. On whose authority, Marin? Commander Draven arranged it. On the Alpha King's orders. Celine absorbed this the way she absorbed bad intelligence on the battlefield. Quietly. Completely. Without external reaction. She filed it alongside every other piece of data she had been collecting for months, without admitting to herself that she was collecting it. The late meetings, the sealed documents she was no longer shown, the trips Rowan took to the northern border that lasted 3 days longer than necessary, and that he returned from with something changed behind his eyes, something she could smell on him like wood smoke from a fire she was not invited to sit beside. How long? Celine asked. How long what? How long has she been here? In the territory, under his protection, as he calls it. Marin's silence was the loudest thing in the room. 3 months, Marin finally said. Maybe longer, I am not certain. 3 months. Celine had spent the last 3 months preparing for the ceremony, overseeing the logistics of hosting delegations from every clan in the Empire, managing food stores, security rotations, diplomatic protocols. She had been so buried in the work of making his kingdom function that she had not seen what was being built right beside her. Or maybe she had seen it and chosen not to look. She left Marin and walked through the great hall toward the main corridor. The noise of the celebration faded behind her. The stone corridors were quiet, lit by oil lamps that threw unsteady shadows on the walls. Her boots were silent on the floor. 7 years of moving through war zones had taught her to walk without sound. She climbed the staircase to the West Tower. The tower was the oldest part of the fortress, built when the first Alpha still slept on animal skins and ate with his hands. The walls were thicker here, the windows narrower. The air smelled of old stone and something else, something faintly sweet, like dried flowers or honey. She heard voices before she reached the top. 2 voices. One she knew so well it lived inside her own pulse. The other was unfamiliar, lighter, with an accent she could not place. Northern, maybe, or somewhere farther, somewhere beyond the territory maps she had studied. Celine stopped at the turn in the staircase. She pressed her back against the cold wall and listened. You should not have come tonight. Rowan's voice, low, urgent, stripped of the public authority he wore like another layer of armor. This was the voice underneath. The real one. The one Celine had heard only in their most private moments, in the dark, when the kingdom and the wars and the endless machinery of power fell away, and there were just 2 people breathing beside each other. He was using that voice with someone else. I had no choice. Lyra. Her voice was steady, almost calm, but there was something underneath it, a current. They moved the timeline. The council session was supposed to be after the winter solstice. Thorn pushed it forward. How far forward? 2 weeks. Maybe less. A silence. Celine heard Rowan exhale. She knew the sound. It was the sound he made when the situation was worse than he had calculated, when the ground was shifting beneath a plan he had thought was solid. If Thorn controls the council vote, the Northern Alliance fractures, Rowan said. And if the Northern Alliance fractures, I lose the eastern border within a month. You lose more than the eastern border. You lose legitimacy. Thorn has been whispering to the minor clans for months. He is telling them the Vale bloodline is weakening, that you are distracted, that your mate controls more of the kingdom than you do. Another silence. This one sharper. Celine felt it in her teeth. Celine does not control the kingdom, Rowan said. I know that, you know that, but the minor clans do not see strategy meetings and supply chains. They see a female wolf who speaks to the council without being asked, who overrides military commanders, who walks into rooms where traditional mates are not permitted. They see a threat to the old order, and Thorn is using that fear. Celine built this kingdom as much as I did. I am not questioning what she built. I am telling you what your enemies are using against you. There is a difference, and if you cannot see it, Thorn will destroy you before spring. Celine stood in the dark staircase and felt something crack inside her. Not her heart, something deeper than that, something structural. A load-bearing wall in the architecture of who she was and what she believed she was doing in this place. She was not angry. Not yet. Anger was a secondary emotion. It came later when the mind had processed the data and decided on a response. What she felt now was the thing before anger. The raw animal recognition that the world had just shifted, and nothing she did from this point forward could be based on what she had believed 5 minutes ago. She climbed the last steps. The room at the top of the West Tower was small, lit by a single oil lamp on a wooden table. Rowan stood with his back to the window, his ceremonial armor still on, his face caught between shadow and light. Lyra sat in a chair by the table, her cloak removed, revealing a simple dark tunic and the lean, watchful body of someone who had spent their life in places where relaxation could get you killed. They were close. Not touching, but close enough that the air between them held something. Intimacy. Familiarity. The casual proximity of two people who had spent time together in private, enough time that their bodies had learned each other's boundaries. Rowan saw her first. She watched the blood drain from his face. It happened fast, the way color leaves a landscape when a cloud crosses the sun. One moment he was alive with urgency and focus, the closest to real she had seen him in months. The next he was gray. Celine, do not say my name like that, like I am a problem you need to solve. Lyra stood. She did not hurry. She rose from the chair with a measured grace that Celine recognized as the movement of someone who had been trained to remain calm when situations collapsed. Spy, Celine thought, or soldier, or something in between. I will leave, Lyra said. No, Celine said. You will stay. You will stay, and you will tell me exactly what you are and what you are doing in my kingdom, in my home, on the night of my ceremony, alone with my mate in a room that smells like you have been living in it for weeks. Lyra looked at Rowan. The look was brief, questioning, a silent conversation conducted in a language Celine was not fluent in, and that, more than the private room, more than the soft voice, more than the closeness, was what drove the blade in deepest. They had a language she did not speak. They had built something between them that existed outside of her, without her, in the spaces she had been too busy keeping the kingdom alive to notice. Lyra is an intelligence asset, Rowan said. She has been embedded in Thorn's network for 8 months. The information she provides is critical to the security of the kingdom. An intelligence asset in the royal wing, using your private voice. While I am downstairs wearing a blood oath on my hand and smiling at people who are congratulating me on a bond you have already broken. I have not broken anything. Then look me in the eye and tell me you have not touched her. The silence that followed was the kind of silence that changes the shape of rooms. It pressed against the walls, it sucked the warmth from the oil lamp, it made the stone floor feel like ice beneath Celine's boots. Rowan did not speak. Celine nodded. The nod was small, controlled, the movement of someone confirming a diagnosis they already suspected. She looked at Lyra. The younger woman met her eyes and did not flinch, and Celine saw something in her expression that was almost like respect. You are good at your work, Celine said to Lyra. I will give you that. You found the one gap in his armor that I left unguarded because I was stupid enough to believe it did not need guarding. She turned back to Rowan. 7 years. I have given you 7 years. I have bled for this kingdom. I have killed for it. I have held it together while you played the conquering hero, and in return you gave me a ceremony and a cloak made from a dead animal and a blood oath you took with another woman's scent on your skin. It is not that simple. It is exactly that simple. You are just too much of a coward to say it plainly. His eyes flashed. The wolf behind them stirred. the alpha instinct that did not tolerate challenges, that demanded submission. She saw his body tighten, saw the predator rise to the surface, and she did not care. She had faced worse than his wolf. She had faced worse than any wolf alive. Choose your next words carefully, Celine. Or what? You will exile me, silence me, add me to the list of inconvenient women who loved the wrong king and disappeared from the histories? You can try. But I promise you, Rowan, I did not survive the things I survived to be erased by a man who does not have the spine to tell me the truth to my face. She pulled the ceremonial cloak from her shoulders and let it fall to the stone floor. The heavy white pelt collapsed at her feet like a slain animal. She looked at it for a moment, then stepped over it and walked toward the door. Celine, wait. For what? For the explanation? For the part where you tell me it meant nothing? It was strategy, it was for the kingdom? Save it. I have heard enough kings justify enough betrayals to fill a library. The words are always different. The meaning is always the same. I was not enough, and you did not have the decency to tell me before you let me bleed myself dry for you. She stopped at the door. She did not turn around. One last thing. Whoever Thorn is, whatever conspiracy you are managing with your intelligence asset in her comfortable room in your tower, it will destroy you. Not because the plan is flawed, because you built it on a lie, and lies are the worst foundations in the world. They hold until the first real storm, and then everything comes down. She walked out. The staircase was dark. She descended through the dark and did not touch the walls for balance, because she did not trust herself to touch anything right now. Her hands were shaking again, not like before, not the subtle tremor of instinct. This was the full-body shake of adrenaline and grief, and the violent restructuring of a reality she had spent 7 years constructing. She reached the lower corridor. The sounds of the celebration still echoed from the great hall, laughter and music and the clink of cups. These people were celebrating her bond. They were toasting her name. They were telling stories about the Alpha King and his fierce mate, the woman who helped him build an empire, the love story for the ages. She walked past the great hall without entering. She walked through the courtyard where the torches were beginning to burn low. She walked down the processional road where the warriors had stood at attention hours ago, and now the path was empty, the snow trampled into mud. She walked until the fortress was behind her and the darkness ahead was complete, and the only light was the thin, pale moon overhead, watching her with the same cold indifference it had watched 1,000 years of wolves betray each other beneath its gaze. She did not cry. She would not give him that. Not tonight. Not ever. She reached the edge of the territory boundary, the old stone markers that separated the Vale Kingdom from the wilderness beyond. No wolf crossed these markers alone. Beyond them lay the unaligned territories, the frozen wastelands where rogue wolves and exiled criminals, and things that had no name, hunted in the perpetual dark. Celine stood at the boundary and looked back. The fortress was a distant glow against the mountainside, warm and golden, a monument to everything she had helped build and everything she was about to leave behind. Then she looked forward into the dark. Somewhere behind her, in a warm room at the top of a tower, a king was already convincing himself that she would come back. She always came back. That was the pattern, the script, the story he had written for her without her permission. The loyal woman, the forgiving mate, the one who endured because enduring was what she did. He had no idea that the woman he had written into that story had just burned the script. She stepped across the boundary. Celine Ashford walked into the darkness beyond the Vale Kingdom, and behind her, the first scream rose from the fortress. Not a scream of alarm, a scream of discovery. Someone had found the ceremonial cloak on the floor of the West Tower. Someone had understood what it meant. The future Luna was gone. And in the great hall, still laughing, still celebrating, still toasting a bond that no longer existed, 10,000 wolves had no idea that the only person holding their empire together had just disappeared into the one place where no one could follow her. The drums kept beating. The moon kept watching. And deep in the frozen dark beyond the border, something ancient and patient lifted its head and tasted the air because a new wolf had just entered its territory. A wolf carrying rage and grief and 7 years of secrets, and the kind of dangerous intelligence that empires are built on and destroyed by in equal measure. The wilderness had not seen anything like her in a very long time. It was hungry, and so was she. The cold did not care who she was. That was the first lesson the territory beyond the border taught Celine Ashford, and it taught her within the first hour. The ceremonial gown she still wore beneath her undercloak was designed for torchlit platforms and the admiring gaze of 10,000 wolves, not for the sub-zero wind that cut through the unaligned lands like a blade made of nothing but spite and temperature. Her boots, fine leather stitched by the royal cobbler, soaked through before she had covered 2 miles. The mud and snowmelt found every seam, every stitch, every gap between material and skin, and it did not ask permission before entering. She walked anyway. The terrain north of the Vale boundary was not wilderness in the poetic sense. It was not some sweeping, beautiful emptiness that songwriters described while sitting warm beside their fires. It was ugly. Dense, black-trunked pine forests choked with undergrowth that tore at clothing and skin. Frozen creeks that looked solid but cracked underfoot without warning, plunging a leg knee-deep into water cold enough to stop the heart. Rocky outcroppings slick with ice. And everywhere, the smell of decay, of things that had died in the cold and been preserved by it, frozen mid-rot, waiting for a thaw that might never come. Celine kept moving because stopping meant thinking, and thinking meant feeling, and feeling meant the thing in her chest would crack open completely and she would not be able to put herself back together. Not out here, not alone. The body had rules the heart did not. The body said, move or freeze. The body said, find shelter before the temperature drops another 10 degrees or your extremities begin to die. The body did not care about Rowan Vale or copper-haired women in tower rooms or 7 years of loyalty repaid with silence. The body was the only honest thing she had left. She found shelter 3 hours before dawn, a rocky overhang on the leeward side of a ridge, deep enough to block the wind, narrow enough that nothing large could approach without being heard. She crawled inside, stripped off the soaked outer layers, wrung them as dry as her shaking hands could manage, and pressed her back against the stone. The rock was cold but dry, and after the wet, dry felt like warmth. She did not sleep. She sat in the dark and listened to the forest, the creak of frozen branches, the distant howl of something that was not a wolf but wanted to sound like one, the percussion of her own heartbeat, loud in her ears, steady despite everything. Her mind kept returning to the tower room, the lamp, the table. Lyra sitting with her legs crossed and her chin slightly raised, the posture of someone who owned space she had no right to. And Rowan, his voice stripped bare, his face alive in a way it had not been alive when he looked at Celine in months, maybe years. She replayed the conversation she had overheard, not the emotional content. She had already processed that and filed it in the part of her mind where pain lived, locked behind a door she would open later when it was safe. What she replayed now was the intelligence. Thorn, a name she recognized. Aldrich Thorn, senior member of the Inner Council, a wolf of the old bloodlines who had served Rowan's father before the collapse and then knelt to Rowan when the new order rose from the ashes. A pragmatist, everyone said, a survivor, the kind of wolf who always found himself on the winning side of every conflict because he chose his side after the conflict was already decided. Thorn was moving against Rowan. That was what Lyra had said. Thorn was whispering to the minor clans, undermining the Alpha's legitimacy, pushing a council vote forward. And Lyra was embedded in Thorn's network, feeding intelligence back to Rowan. Celine turned this over in her mind the way she had turned over battlefield intelligence for 7 years. She looked at it from every angle. She tested it for gaps, and what she found was a shape she did not like. If Lyra was an intelligence asset, why was she housed in the royal wing? Assets were kept at arm's length. You did not bring them into your home. You did not give them rooms next to your own chambers. You met them in safe houses, in neutral locations, in places that could be denied. That was basic operational security. Rowan knew this. He had built his intelligence network from nothing during the border wars. He understood tradecraft. Unless the intelligence relationship was not the primary relationship, unless the information Lyra provided was real but secondary to something else, something Rowan needed from her that had nothing to do with Thorn or council votes or the security of the kingdom. Celine closed her eyes. The cold pressed against her eyelids like fingers. She had spent 7 years making herself indispensable. She had studied every aspect of kingdom management because she understood at a level deeper than language that a woman with no bloodline and no pack affiliation survived only by being useful. Love was not protection. Love was what men offered you instead of protection. a word they used to keep you close while they made decisions that affected your life without consulting you. Usefulness was protection. Competence was protection. Being the person who held the keys to systems no one else understood was protection, and it had worked. For 7 years, it had worked. She had made herself the load-bearing wall of Rowan's kingdom, and he had needed her, and needing her had looked enough like loving her that she had accepted the substitution. But need was not loyalty. Need was a transaction, and transactions ended when someone found a better price. Dawn came slowly, a thin gray light seeping through the clouds like water through cloth. Celine emerged from the overhang and assessed her situation with the cold clarity of a field commander. She was approximately 15 miles north of the Vale boundary, in unaligned territory. She had no food, no weapons except the ceremonial knife still strapped to her thigh, no supplies, and no plan beyond the immediate imperative of survival. She was wearing clothes designed for a ceremony, not an expedition. She had perhaps 48 hours before hypothermia or starvation forced critical decisions. She started walking north. The choice was deliberate. South meant the Vale Kingdom. South meant Rowan. And explanations. And the suffocating performance of forgiveness that would be expected of her. East and west meant the minor clan territories, where she would be recognized and reported and dragged back to the fortress like a runaway dog. North meant the deep wilderness, and beyond that the frozen reaches where the old settlements lay abandoned, and beyond that the Harrowfield border. She had contacts in Harrowfield. Not allies. Not friends. Contacts. People who owed her favors from the border wars, debts they had never expected to be collected because they assumed she would spend her life inside the Vale Fortress, playing Luna, never needing anything from anyone outside the royal walls. They assumed wrong. By midday, she had covered another 8 miles, and her body was beginning to fail. The hunger was manageable. She had gone longer without food during the southern campaigns, but the cold was cumulative, a debt that compounded with every hour, and her wet boots had turned her feet into blocks of pain that she could feel less and less with each step. She knew what that meant. She had seen frostbite in the war camps. She had seen men lose toes, feet, entire legs below the knee because they pushed too far in bad weather and told themselves they were tough enough to handle it. Toughness was not a strategy. It was what people called stubbornness after it happened to work. She found the cabin by accident. It was not on any map she knew, which meant it was either very old or very deliberately hidden. A low structure of notched logs and stone, built against the base of a cliff, with a roof of layered bark and pine boughs that sagged under the weight of accumulated snow. The door was heavy timber, warped but intact, and it swung inward when she pushed. Inside, a single room, a stone hearth with a rusted iron grate, a wooden platform that might have been a bed, shelves on one wall holding clay jars sealed with wax, a pile of split wood in the corner, dry, seasoned, clearly stored by someone who intended to return. Celine did not hesitate. She built a fire. Her hands were clumsy with cold, her fingers barely responsive, but she had built fires in worse conditions, and muscle memory carried her where dexterity could not. The wood caught. The flame grew. Heat began to push back against the cold in the small space, and she crouched beside the hearth and held her hands so close to the fire she could smell the hair on her knuckles beginning to singe. She opened the clay jars. Dried meat, hard grain, something that smelled like herbs preserved in fat. Enough to sustain one person for a week, maybe 2, if rationed carefully. Someone maintained this place. Someone came here regularly enough to stock supplies and keep dry wood. A hunter, maybe. Or a scout. Or someone who needed a place to disappear to, a place that existed outside the knowledge of kings and councils and the machinery of territorial power. She ate slowly. The dried meat was tough and oversalted, and it was the best thing she had ever tasted. She chewed each piece until it dissolved and swallowed and felt the calories enter her bloodstream like reinforcements arriving at a besieged position. Her body began to warm. Her fingers regained sensation, and with sensation came pain, sharp and bright, the nerves waking up and immediately complaining about what had been done to them. She stripped off her boots and examined her feet, red, swollen. The early stages of frostbite on 2 toes of her left foot, the skin white and waxy. She held them near the fire and massaged them and gritted her teeth against the agony of blood returning to tissue that had begun to die. She would keep the toes? Barely. She spent 3 days in the cabin. 3 days of silence and solitude and the slow, painful process of a mind reorganizing itself around a new reality. She did not wallow. Wallowing was a luxury for people who had somewhere safe to fall apart. She worked. She inventoried the supplies. She fashioned better footwear from materials in the cabin, wrapping her boots in strips of bark and animal hide she found in a storage chest. She scouted the surrounding terrain in careful, concentric circles, mapping the landscape, identifying water sources, noting animal tracks, and the territorial markings of whatever predators claimed this stretch of forest. And she thought, not about Rowan, not about the betrayal. Those thoughts came, of course, in the quiet hours by the fire, in the moments before sleep claimed her. They came like wolves themselves, circling, testing, looking for weakness. But she did not feed them. She acknowledged their presence the way you acknowledge a wound. It exists. It hurts. You treat it and move on. What she thought about was Thorn. The intelligence Lyra had shared in the tower was incomplete, but it was enough to construct a framework. Thorn was building a coalition against Rowan. He was using the minor clans, leveraging their traditional resentment of centralized power, promising them autonomy or favorable terms or whatever currency bought loyalty in the lower territories. He was pushing a council vote, seat, some kind of procedural mechanism that would strip authority from the Alpha or redistribute it among the old bloodlines. And he had accelerated the timeline, which meant either he felt confident in his numbers or something had forced his hand. The question was why. Thorn was old, powerful in the way that old council members were powerful, through networks and debts and the accumulated knowledge of decades spent navigating the machinery of governance. But he was not a revolutionary. He did not want to destroy the system. He wanted to control it. Men like Thorn did not burn down the house. They changed the locks. So who was behind him? Who was providing the resources, the strategy, the ambition that Thorn himself lacked? Because someone was. Celine had spent enough time in the council chambers to recognize the difference between a wolf acting on his own instincts and a wolf being directed. Thorn was being directed. The acceleration, the targeting of minor clans, the specific use of Celine's influence as a wedge issue, all of it was too coordinated, too strategic for a single old wolf playing politics. On the third night, she heard footsteps outside the cabin. She moved instantly, fire dampened, ceremonial knife in her hand, back pressed against the wall beside the door, body coiled, breath controlled. 3 heartbeats. 4. The footsteps stopped outside the door. A pause. Then 3 knocks. Slow. Deliberate. A pattern. The door opened. The wolf who entered was not what she expected. He was young, maybe 30, with the lean, angular build of a runner. His face was scarred along the right side, old burns that had healed badly and pulled the skin taut, giving him a permanent expression of mild surprise. He wore traveling clothes, practical and worn, and he carried a pack on one shoulder and a long-bladed knife on his hip. He saw Celine and stopped. His eyes went to the knife in her hand, then to her face, then to the knife again. He did not reach for his own weapon. "You are Celine Ashford," he said, "and you know this cabin exists, which makes one of us more interesting than the other. My name is Kael. I am a scout for the Harrowfield Pack. Harrowfield scouts do not operate this far south. They do when the Alpha King's mate disappears on the night of the Moonfire ceremony, and every wolf within 300 miles starts asking questions." Celine did not lower the knife. "What questions?" Kael set his pack down slowly, keeping his hands visible. He moved like someone who had been around dangerous people before and had learned that sudden gestures shorten conversations permanently. The official word from the fortress is that you suffered a breakdown, emotional collapse. The pressure of the ceremony and the responsibilities of the Luna position overwhelmed you, and you fled into the wilderness in a state of temporary madness. A breakdown. That is the story Rowan's council is telling the clans. Which members of the council? Commander Draven made the initial announcement, but the language came from Thorn. Everyone who has been paying attention knows Thorn's style. Careful words, reasonable tone, just enough sympathy to sound compassionate while laying the groundwork for permanent removal. Celine felt something shift inside her chest. Not pain this time, something colder, harder, sharper. The feeling of a weapon being forged. "Permanent removal," she repeated. Aluna declared mentally unfit cannot hold her position. It is in the old codes. Thorn has been quoting the old codes a lot lately. And Rowan? What is the Alpha King saying? Kale hesitated. The scar tissue on his face pulled tight. He is saying nothing. Nothing. He has not made a public statement since the ceremony. He has not confirmed or denied Thorn's account. He has not sent search parties. He has not done anything. Celine absorbed this. She let it settle into the framework she was building, another piece clicking into place. Rowan's silence was not grief. It was not shock. It was calculation. He was waiting. He was assessing the political landscape, measuring the cost of different responses, deciding which version of events best served his position. He was managing her disappearance the same way he managed every crisis, as a variable in an equation, not as a person. "Why are you here?" Celine asked Kael. "Harrowfield sent you to find me specifically?" "Not officially. Harrowfield does not get involved in Vale internal politics. Officially, I am on a routine border patrol." "And unofficially?" "Unofficially, my Alpha asked me to find you and deliver a message." "What message?" "The Harrowfield Pack remembers what you did during the border raids. When the southern clans hit our supply lines and the Vale Kingdom refused to send aid because the political cost was too high, you sent supplies anyway. Grain, medicine, weapons. You routed them through back channels so Rowan's council would not know. 300 wolves in the eastern settlement survived that winter because of what you did. That was 5 years ago. 5 years is nothing to a wolf who would have starved without your help. My Alpha remembers. The elders remember. Their children remember." Kale reached into his pack and produced a rolled piece of leather, tied with a cord. He held it out. "This is a territorial pass. It grants you safe passage through Harrowfield lands and guarantees the protection of the pack for as long as you need it." Celine looked at the leather roll. She did not take it. "What does your Alpha want in return?" Kael allowed himself a thin smile, the first expression that reached his eyes since he entered the cabin. "She said you would ask that. She said to tell you nothing, not yet. But the world is changing, and wolves with your particular skills will be needed before it is done changing. Consider the pass an investment." "An investment in what?" "In the possibility that the woman who built the Vale Kingdom might have opinions about what the Wolf Empire should look like once the current crisis finishes tearing it apart." Celine studied him. The scars, the careful posture, the intelligence behind the eyes. This was not a simple scout delivering a simple message. This was a diplomat wrapped in field clothes, and the message he carried was not from a minor border pack offering charity. It was from a player entering the game. She took the leather roll. "Tell your Alpha I accept the pass. And tell her I need information. Everything Harrowfield Intelligence has on Aldrich Thorn. His finances, his alliances, his communications with the minor clans, everything." She anticipated that as well. "The information will be waiting for you at the Harrowfield border outpost. 2 days' travel north from here. Follow the river upstream until you reach the falls. The outpost is in the ravine on the eastern bank." Kale shouldered his pack and turned to leave. At the door, he paused. "One more thing. There's a name that keeps appearing in Thorn's communications, a name no one in our network can identify." "What name?" "Voss? Does it mean anything to you?" Celine's expression did not change. She had trained herself long ago to keep her face neutral when information hit her, the way a wall keeps standing when a wave strikes it. The wall does not react. The wall absorbs. But inside, behind the wall, something detonated. "No," she said. "It means nothing." Kael looked at her for a long moment, and she knew he did not believe her, and she knew he would not press. He nodded and walked into the dark, and his footsteps crunched on the frozen ground and faded into the silence of the forest. Celine stood alone in the cabin with the fire reduced to embers and the ceremonial knife still in her hand, and the leather pass clutched in the other, and the name Voss ringing in her skull like a bell struck in an empty room. Voss. She knew the name. She knew it from before. From the years she never spoke about, the years in the South, the years of hunger and violence, and the education in what power actually looked like when it stopped pretending to be civilized. Voss was not a person. Voss was a title, or a code name, or a designation used by a network that operated so far beneath the surface of wolf politics that most wolves did not know it existed. She had encountered the Voss network once, 7 years ago, in the months before she met Rowan. She had been 19, alone, moving through the Southern Territories after the collapse of her birth pack, surviving on theft and violence and the refusal to die. She had stumbled into something she should not have seen. A meeting. In a basement beneath a burned-out settlement. Wolves from different territories, different bloodlines, different factions, sitting around a table and speaking in a language she did not understand. Not a foreign tongue. A code. A system of references and allusions that meant nothing to an outsider but clearly carried enormous weight for the wolves using them. She had been caught. She had been held for 3 days in a room with no light. A wolf had come to question her. A wolf with no name and no insignia, and a voice that sounded like gravel being crushed. He had asked her what she had seen. She had told him nothing because she had understood nothing. He had believed her or decided she was not worth the trouble of killing, and she had been released at the edge of the territory with a warning that she would not be released a second time. She had never spoken of it. Not to Rowan. Not to anyone. She had buried it the way you bury something radioactive. Deep and sealed and marked with warnings. And now the name was surfacing in Thorne's communications, which meant the network she had glimpsed 7 years ago was connected to the conspiracy inside Rowan's kingdom, which meant this was not a simple power grab by an ambitious councilman. This was something older, deeper, more coordinated than anything she had imagined. She left the cabin at first light. The journey north took 2.5 days. She traveled hard, pushing through terrain that would have stopped a less experienced wolf, crossing frozen rivers on foot, climbing ridgelines in wind that turned exposed skin numb within minutes. She ate sparingly from the supplies she had taken from the cabin. She slept in 4-hour intervals, curled against whatever windbreak she could find, waking to darkness and cold and the distant sounds of the wilderness, doing what the wilderness always did, consuming whatever was too slow or too careless to keep moving. She found the Harrowfield outpost exactly where Cale had described it. It was built into the rock face of the ravine, hidden from above by the overhang and from below by a screen of dense evergreens. A functional, ugly structure of timber and stone, designed not to be seen, designed not to be comfortable, designed for the single purpose of existing in a place where no one expected anything to exist. 2 wolves guarded the entrance. They checked the leather pass, examined her face, exchanged a glance that carried an entire conversation, and stepped aside. Inside, a low-ceilinged room lit by oil lamps, a table covered in maps and documents, and sitting at the table, waiting for her with a cup of something hot and a face that showed absolutely nothing, was a woman Celine had never met but recognized immediately from the intelligence briefings she had read during the border wars. Nara Harrowfield, Alpha of the Harrowfield Pack, the youngest Alpha in the Northern Territories, and by most accounts the most dangerous. Nara was small. That was the first thing anyone noticed, and it was also the thing that got the most people killed. She stood perhaps 5'4", with a compact, wiry frame and hands that looked like they belonged to a musician. Her hair was black, cut short, and her eyes were the pale gray of river ice. She sat with the absolute stillness of a predator that does not need to move to dominate a space. "You look like something the forest chewed up and decided was not worth swallowing," Nara said. "I have had a difficult week. Sit down, drink this, then we will talk." Celine sat. The cup contained a bitter herbal brew that burned going down and spread warmth through her chest like a slow fire. She drank it in 3 long swallows and set the cup down and looked at Nara across the table and waited. "Everything Cale told you is accurate," Nara said. "I had him verified before I sent him. The official story inside the Veil is that you lost your mind and fled. Thorne is using it to consolidate support. He has already secured pledges from 4 minor clans and is working on a 5th. The council vote he is pushing would create a formal advisory body with veto power over Alpha decisions. In practice, it would make Rowan a figurehead. And Rowan is letting it happen. Rowan does not know the full extent of what is happening. He thinks Thorne is a manageable problem. He thinks Lyra's intelligence is giving him the upper hand. Lyra's intelligence is compromised." Nara raised an eyebrow. "Just one." The gesture was small and precise, and somehow more expressive than another person's entire face. "Explain." "Lyra was presented to me as an asset embedded in Thorne's network, but she was living in the Royal Wing, in quarters arranged by Commander Draven, with access to the Alpha King that no legitimate asset would be given. Either Rowan's operational security has completely collapsed, or Lyra is not what he thinks she is. Or both. Or both. Nara leaned back in her chair. What do you know about the name Voss? I know enough to know that if Voss is involved, this is not about one old councilman trying to grab power. Voss is infrastructure. Voss is the kind of network that does not bother with kingdoms unless it plans to reshape the entire map. You have encountered them before. It was not a question. Celine met Nara's pale gray eyes and understood that the Harrowfield Alpha already knew more about Celine's past than Celine had ever voluntarily shared with anyone.
Once, a long time ago, I did not understand what I was seeing. And now? Now I think I am beginning to. Nara pushed a stack of documents across the table. Thorne's communications for the last 6 months. Financial records, encoded messages, meeting transcripts from sources inside 3 different clan territories. My intelligence wolves have been collecting this since the first whispers of a council reorganization.
Celine pulled the documents toward her and began reading. She read the way she had always read intelligence, fast and methodical, cataloging names and dates and amounts and connections, building a map in her mind of relationships and dependencies and vulnerabilities. Within an hour, she had a picture. Within 2 hours, the picture had become a landscape. It was worse than she thought. Thorne was not the architect. Thorne was the front. Behind him, funding flowed from sources that dead-ended in shell structures and false names, but the volume of resources was staggering. Someone was pouring wealth into the destabilization of the Vale Kingdom on a scale that no single clan or even alliance of clans could sustain. The money was buying not just political loyalty, but military capability. Weapons, training, mercenary wolves recruited from the exile territories, a private army being assembled in pieces, distributed across multiple locations, invisible to anyone not looking for it, and in the margins of the encoded messages, like a watermark barely visible beneath the text, the name Voss appeared again and again. They are not trying to remove Rowan from power, Selene said, looking up from the documents. They are trying to collapse the entire centralized Alpha system. Every kingdom, every territory. The Vale is just the first domino. Nara nodded slowly. That is our assessment as well. The question is what we do about it. We? You do not have a pack, Celine. You do not have resources, allies, or territory. What you have is 7 years of institutional knowledge about the most powerful kingdom in the Wolf Empire and a mind that built half of its operational systems. I have a pack, resources, and intelligence capabilities that reach into every major territory in the north. Separately, we are both vulnerable. Together, we are something else. What are we together? A problem for everyone who thinks the current crisis will play out the way they planned. Celine looked at the documents on the table. She looked at the maps on the wall. She looked at Nara Harrowfield, this small, still, dangerous woman who had sent a scout into the wilderness to find a broken-hearted former Luna and offer her exactly the thing she needed most. Not comfort, not sympathy, not the patronizing concern of someone who saw her as a victim. A mission. I need 3 things, Celine said. First, a secure communication channel to a contact inside the Vale Fortress, someone who is not on Thorne's payroll and is not under Draven's command. I have 2 candidates. You will choose which one. Second, I need access to the old trade routes through the northern mountains, the ones that were closed after the border wars. Those routes are controlled by the rogue packs. I know who controls them. I also know that the rogue packs have been quietly trading with someone who pays in Vale Kingdom currency, which means someone inside the kingdom is already using those routes. I need to find out who and what they are moving. Nara's eyes narrowed. And the third thing? Celine placed her palm flat on the table, on top of the stack of documents and the encoded messages and the financial records and the name Voss, written in ink that looked almost black in the lamplight. I need you to understand something about me. I am not doing this for Rowan. I am not doing this to save his kingdom or his throne or his legacy. I spent 7 years building something I believed was real, and it was not, and I am done building things for men who do not see me as anything more than a useful tool. What I am doing because the Voss network does not care about Rowan Vale. They do not care about Thorne or the minor clans or the council vote. They care about power. Pure, structural, permanent power. And if they get it, every wolf in every territory, every family, Every child born into this world will live under a system that makes the current one look gentle. I have seen what they are. I saw it once in a basement in the South, and I have never forgotten. So I am not here as Rowan's mate, or his Luna, or his ally. I am here as someone who knows what is coming and refuses to let it arrive. Nara studied her for a long time. The lamplight flickered. The wind outside pressed against the walls of the outpost, and the timber groaned but held. Good, Nara said. Sentiment makes bad strategy. Welcome to Harrowfield. 300 miles to the south, in the royal fortress of the Vale Kingdom, Alpha King Rowan Vale stood alone in the West Tower room where everything had fallen apart and stared at the white ceremonial cloak still crumpled on the stone floor where Celine had dropped it. He had not picked it up. He had not allowed anyone else to enter the room. For 3 days the cloak had lain there, and for 3 days he had come to this room every night after the council sessions and the briefings and the endless grinding performance of authority, and he had stood over the fallen cloak and tried to feel something that made sense. He could not. The door opened behind him. He did not turn. The Eastern delegation is requesting a formal audience, Commander Draven said. They want clarification on the Luna's status. Tell them she is recovering in seclusion. That is what we told them yesterday and the day before. They are not going to accept it much longer. The Thornwood clan is already sending messages to the minor houses claiming she was exiled. She was not exiled. She left. The distinction does not matter if no one believes it. Rowan turned. Draven stood in the doorway, a broad-shouldered wolf with a soldier's face and a soldier's directness. They had fought together for 6 years. Draven was the closest thing Rowan had to a friend, which meant they trusted each other in battle and lied to each other about everything else. Have you found her? Rowan asked. Tracking teams lost her scent at the northern boundary. She crossed into unaligned territory. Send more teams into unaligned territory, without provocation or treaty authority, while Thorn is watching every move you make and using every misstep to erode your support. I did not ask for your political analysis. I asked you to find her. Draven was quiet for a moment. He looked at the cloak on the floor, then back at Rowan. Permission to speak freely. When have you ever needed permission? Let her go. The words landed in the room like a stone dropped into still water. Rowan felt them impact somewhere behind his ribs. She is a liability now, Draven continued. The story Thorn is spreading works in our favor if we let it. A Luna who broke under pressure. Tragic, sympathetic, and most importantly, gone. It removes the argument that she wields too much influence. It gives you space to operate without the council using her as leverage. You are asking me to abandon her. I'm asking you to prioritize the kingdom. The same thing she would ask you to do if she were standing here. Rowan looked at Draven and felt something move behind his eyes, something old and predatory that did not negotiate and did not calculate and did not care about councils or politics or the delicate architecture of alliances. The Alpha, the wolf, the thing inside him that had claimed Celine Ashford 7 years ago and had never been asked whether the bond was convenient or strategic or wise. It had simply claimed, the way a wolf claims, absolutely. And he had betrayed it. Not with Lyra, though that was part of it. He had betrayed it by forgetting what the claim meant, by allowing the machinery of the kingdom to grind down the raw, animal truth of what he was and what she was to him, until the bond became another political asset to be managed and optimized, and when necessary, sacrificed. Get out, Rowan said. Rowan. Get out of this room, Draven, now. Draven left. His footsteps faded down the stone staircase, and Rowan was alone again with the cloak and the silence and the growing terrible certainty that the biggest mistake of his life was not what had happened in this room 3 nights ago, but what was about to happen because of it. He knelt. He picked up the cloak. The white fur was cold and stiff, and it smelled like her. Not perfume. Celine had never worn perfume. It smelled like pine and cold air, and the particular, indefinable scent of a woman who had worked harder than anyone around her every single day for 7 years and had never once asked to be thanked. He held the cloak against his chest and closed his eyes and felt the wolf inside him howl. In the Harrowfield outpost, Celine opened the first encoded message from the Voss network and began to read. And 300 miles of frozen wilderness between them, growing wider by the hour, pulsed with the silent, gathering energy of a war that neither of them fully understood yet, but that both of them, in the deepest and most animal part of their beings, could feel coming the way wolves feel a storm before the first cloud crosses the horizon. The wind changed direction. It blew from the south now. It carried the smell of burning. The encoded messages from the Voss network were written in a cipher system Celine had never seen before, and she had seen most of them. During the border wars, she had personally cracked 4 different encoding methods used by the southern insurgents, sitting in a command tent with a candle stub and a sheet of parchment, working letter by letter through the night, while Rowan slept 3 feet away on a camp cot. She had a mind that found patterns in noise the way a hawk finds movement in tall grass. It was not a talent she had been born with. It was a muscle she had built through years of necessity, through the understanding that in a world designed to keep wolves like her invisible, the ability to see what others could not was the only currency that mattered. But the Voss cipher resisted her for 9 days. She worked in a small room at the Harrowfield outpost that Nara had cleared for her use. A table, a chair, a lamp, the stack of intercepted documents, and a growing collection of parchment sheets covered in her handwriting, columns of letters and numbers, and frequency analyses and dead ends. She ate when Nara's wolves brought food. She slept when her vision blurred too badly to read. The rest of the time, she worked. On the 4th day, Nara came to check on her. "You have not left this room in 36 hours. I'm close." "You said that yesterday." "Yesterday I was guessing. Today I am close." Nara leaned against the doorframe and studied Celine with those pale gray eyes that missed nothing and revealed less. "My intelligence wolves have been trying to break that cipher for 2 months. I have a cryptographer in the Eastern Settlement who trained under the old code masters. She could not crack it either." "Your cryptographer does not know what I know." "Which is what?" Celine put down her pen and looked at Nara. She had not slept in a day and a half, and her eyes felt like they had been scrubbed with sand, and her back ached from hunching over the table. And none of that mattered because somewhere in the pattern of these encoded messages was the shape of a conspiracy that was about to swallow everything she had ever built. The Voss cipher is not a substitution code. It is not transposition. It is a referential system. Each encoded phrase points to a specific passage in a source text. Without the source text, the cipher is unbreakable. "And you know the source text?" "I think I do. 7 years ago, when I was held by the Voss network in the South, the wolf who questioned me had a book on the table beside him. I did not understand its significance at the time. I was 19, starving, terrified. But I saw the cover, I saw the title, and I remember it because the mind remembers everything that happens during extreme fear. It burns the details in like a brand." "What was the book?" "The Ashenmere Codex, the original territorial charter written by the first Alpha 300 years ago. There are supposedly only 3 copies in existence, one in the Vale Royal Library, one in the Council Archives, and one that was believed lost during the War of Succession. The lost copy. Voss has it, and they are using it as their cipher key." Nara was quiet for a moment. Then she straightened from the doorframe. "I will send word to my contact in the Vale territory. The Royal Library copy can be accessed." "No, if Thorn has people inside the fortress, any attempt to access the codex will be noticed. We need the Council Archives copy." "The Council Archives are controlled by Thorn." "Exactly. Which is why we are not going to access it through the archives. We are going to access it through the one person in the Vale Kingdom who has unrestricted clearance to every room in the fortress and owes me enough to risk her neck." "Who?" "Marin, my former attendant. She has served in the royal household for 15 years. She has access codes to every wing, every vault, every sealed chamber. And 3 years ago, when her younger sister was accused of theft by a council member and was facing exile, I intervened. I buried the charges. I protected her family. Marin has not forgotten." Nara assessed this with the cold efficiency of a commander evaluating a tactical option. "Can she be trusted?" "Marin is the most frightened person I have ever known. She is terrified of authority, terrified of conflict, terrified of anything that disrupts the safe, predictable order of her world. And that is exactly why she can be trusted. She will do what I ask because the alternative, refusing me and living with the knowledge that she abandoned the one person who protected her, terrifies her more than the risk. Fear is a reliable motivator." Fear is the only reliable motivator. Everything else is negotiable. The message went out through Nara's intelligence network, a chain of couriers and coded signals that moved information across 300 miles of territory in 48 hours without touching a single road or passing through a single settlement where Thorn's people might intercept it. Celine wrote the message herself, in a personal cipher she and Marin had developed years ago for private communication, a simple system based on a children's rhyme Marin's mother used to sing. It was unsophisticated. It was also unbreakable to anyone who did not know the rhyme, and the only people who knew it were Marin's dead mother, and Celine. The response came back in 6 days. Along with it, copied in Marin's careful handwriting onto 20 sheets of thin parchment, were the relevant passages from the Ashenmere Codex. Celine sat down with the cipher key and the encoded messages and began to translate. The first message decoded in 20 minutes. The second took 10. By the third, she had internalized the system and was reading the Voss communications almost as fast as she could read plain text. And with each message she decoded, the landscape of the conspiracy expanded, and the ground beneath every assumption she had carried for the past 7 years shifted and cracked and began to fall away. The Voss network was not a recent creation. It had been operating for decades. It predated Rowan's kingdom. It predated his father's kingdom. It was a parallel power structure, built in the spaces between the territorial lines, connecting wolves across clan boundaries and bloodline loyalties through a shared interest in something that transcended the petty politics of individual kingdoms. The encoded messages referenced operations, assets, financial structures, and strategic objectives spanning the entire wolf empire, from the southern wastelands to the frozen reaches of the far north. Thorn was a node in this network, one node among dozens, and the resources flowing through his operation were a fraction of the total. But it was the message dated 6 weeks before the Moonfire ceremony that stopped Celine's breath. She read it 3 times. Then she set down the parchment and placed her hands flat on the table and stared at the wall and felt the room tilt around her. The message was from an operative designated only by a numerical code. It was addressed to Thorn, and it concerned Lyra. Lyra's placement in the Vale Kingdom had not been Rowan's idea. It had been orchestrated. The intelligence she provided to Rowan was real, but curated, carefully selected to create the illusion that Rowan was receiving valuable, actionable information while the truly critical data was being withheld or distorted. Lyra was not Rowan's asset. Lyra was Voss's asset. She had been inserted into his orbit through a series of manufactured encounters designed to exploit the specific vulnerabilities in his psychological profile, vulnerabilities that the Voss network had been cataloging for years. The message described those vulnerabilities in clinical detached language. The Alpha's increasing isolation from his mate, his growing dependence on intelligence briefings as a substitute for genuine strategic thinking, his need for validation from sources outside the established power structure, his susceptibility to women who presented themselves as equals rather than subordinates, particularly in private settings where the performance of authority could be dropped. Celine read the assessment of Rowan's weaknesses and recognized every single one of them because she had spent 7 years watching them develop. She had seen them form like cracks in a dam, hairline fractures that she had tried to seal with her own hands, pouring her time, her energy, her love, her labor into the gaps, trying to hold together a man who was slowly coming apart under the weight of what he carried. And the Voss network had watched her do it. They had cataloged her efforts. They had noted the points where her influence stabilized Rowan and the points where it failed. And then they had designed Lyra to fill the exact gaps that Celine could not reach. It was not a seduction. It was an engineering project. Lyra had been built for Rowan the way a key is built for a lock, reverse engineered from the shape of his deficiencies, and inserted with a patience and precision that spoke of resources and intelligence capabilities far beyond anything Celine had imagined. She found Nara in the outpost command room, studying a map of the Northern Territories with 2 of her senior wolves. The conversation stopped when Celine entered. Something in her face silenced the room. "Everyone out," Celine said. Nara looked at her for 2 seconds, then nodded to her wolves. They left without a word. The door closed. "How bad?" Nara asked. "Lyra is Voss." Nara did not react visibly. She had the discipline for that, but her hand, resting on the map table, pressed down fractionally harder, the knuckles whitening. "You are certain?" "It is in the messages. Her placement was planned months in advance. The intelligence she feeds Rowan is controlled. She is not a mole in Thorn's network. She is the mechanism by which Voss controls what Rowan sees and does not see. And Rowan has no idea. Does Thorn know what she is?
Thorn knows she is Voss. He does not know the full scope of her mandate. The messages suggest Thorn believes Lyra is there to monitor Rowan and provide Voss with intelligence. He does not understand that she is actively shaping Rowan's decisions.
Shaping them toward what? Celine put the decoded messages on the table. The council vote Thorn is pushing, the creation of an advisory body with veto power. It looks like a power grab by Thorn. It looks like a standard internal coup. But it is not. The advisory body, if created, would require the Alpha King to submit major territorial decisions for council approval, including military deployments, including border agreements, including, and this is the part that matters, resource extraction rights in the Ashenmere Range. Nara's eyes sharpened.
The deep mines. The deep mines, where the silver ore is found. The ore that powers the monuments, the ceremonial structures, the entire symbolic architecture of the Alpha system. Whoever controls those mines controls the material foundation of wolf authority across every territory. Voss wants the mines.
Voss wants what comes after the mines. The ore is not just symbolic. I have seen references in these messages to applications I do not fully understand. Research, experiments, something the network has been pursuing for decades. They believe the ore has properties beyond what the traditional wolf clans know, and they need unrestricted access to prove it. Nara sat down. She did it slowly, the way a person sits when the weight of what they have just learned makes standing feel unsustainable. This changes everything, Nara said. This changes nothing. The objective is the same: stop the conspiracy, expose the network, protect the territories. The scale is different. The stakes are different, but the work is the same. You sound like a general. I sound like someone who does not have the luxury of being overwhelmed. Nara looked at her for a long time. The lamplight caught the pale gray of her eyes and turned them almost silver. What do you need?
I need to get a message to Rowan. The silence that followed was heavy enough to have its own weather system. Nara stared at her. You want to warn the man who betrayed you. I want to warn the Alpha King that his kingdom is being dismantled from inside his own bedroom. What I feel about the man is irrelevant. Is it? It has to be.
Nara leaned forward. And if he does not believe you? If Lyra has shaped his perception so thoroughly that he dismisses your warning as the ravings of a jealous, unstable former mate, which is exactly the narrative Thorn has been building, then he falls, and we prepare for what comes after. That is cold. That is survival. I learned the difference a long time ago. The message to Rowan was the hardest thing Celine had ever written, and she had written orders that sent wolves to their deaths. She sat alone in the small room with a single sheet of parchment and a pen and the accumulated weight of 7 years pressing on her hand like a physical force. She did not write about the betrayal. She did not write about the tower room or the cloak on the floor or the sound of his voice speaking to another woman in the tone he had once reserved for her. She wrote about the Voss network, about Lyra's true allegiance, about the decoded messages and the Ashenmere mines and the scope of the conspiracy that was coiling around his kingdom like a snake around a sleeping animal. She wrote clearly, factually, without emotion. She included enough decoded intelligence to prove the legitimacy of her claims and enough operational detail to demonstrate that her information came from sources beyond anything Thorn's propaganda could dismiss. She addressed it to Rowan personally and sent it through Nara's courier network with instructions to deliver it to the Alpha King's private chambers by a route that bypassed Commander Draven and the Council entirely. The courier returned in 5 days. He carried no reply. Celine read the absence of response the way a tracker reads the absence of prints. No response was itself a message. It meant one of 3 things. The message had been intercepted before reaching Rowan. The message had reached Rowan and been dismissed. Or the message had reached Rowan and he was acting on it in ways that required silence. She planned for all 3 scenarios. 3 weeks passed. The northern winter deepened. The temperature at the Harrowfield outpost dropped to levels that made breathing feel like swallowing broken glass. Celine spent the days building, organizing, preparing. She studied the Voss communications until she could predict their operational patterns. She mapped the network structure until she could identify its weak points. She worked with Nara's intelligence wolves to establish surveillance on the 3 trade routes she had identified as Voss supply lines. And she waited for the one thing she could not control. Word from the Vale Kingdom. It came not as a message, but as a person. Celine was in the command room reviewing the latest surveillance reports when the outpost sentries brought in a wolf who had nearly died reaching them. He was half frozen, delirious, his clothes torn and bloodied. He had traveled the 300 miles from the Vale Fortress in 6 days, a journey that should have taken 10, pushing through terrain and weather that should have killed him. And the only reason it had not was that the news he carried was more powerful than the cold. They laid him on a cot by the fire. Nara's field medic worked on his frostbitten hands and the deep gash on his left arm that had been crudely bandaged with a strip of fabric torn from his own shirt. Celine knelt beside him and waited for his eyes to focus. "Who sent you?" she asked. His lips were cracked and bloody. His voice came out in a rasp that sounded like metal scraping on stone. "No one sent me. I came because someone had to." "What is your name?" "Brennan. I served in the Alpha's personal guard." Served. Past tense. The personal guard no longer exists. 3 days ago, Commander Draven dissolved it. He replaced it with wolves loyal to the Council, loyal to Thorn. Celine felt the information enter her body like a blade slipping between ribs. Clean, precise, devastating. "Tell me everything," Brennan told her. His voice was halting, broken by coughs and the trembling of a body pushed beyond its limits. But the facts were clear, and they were catastrophic. 2 weeks after Celine's message would have arrived at the fortress, Rowan had summoned a closed session of the Inner Council. He had presented evidence of a conspiracy against the throne. He had named Thorn. He had demanded Thorn's arrest and the dissolution of the advisory body vote. It should have been a decisive stroke. It should have ended the coup before it began. But Rowan had made a mistake. A single, fatal, perfectly predictable mistake. He had warned Lyra. He had gone to her before the council session and told her what he was about to do. He had shown her Celine's intelligence. He had asked for her assessment, because that was what she was to him. His intelligence asset, his private counselor, the woman who helped him see clearly when the fog of politics and power obscured his vision. He trusted her analysis. He depended on it. He had been designed to depend on it. Lyra had listened to everything. She had read the decoded messages. She had studied Celine's analysis, and then she had gone directly to Thorn. When Rowan entered the council chamber, Thorn was already prepared. He had turned Rowan's accusations back on him, presenting fabricated evidence that the Alpha King had been communicating with foreign intelligence through his exiled mate, that the so-called decoded messages were forgeries designed to discredit legitimate political opposition, that Rowan's judgment had been compromised by personal attachment, and that he was no longer fit to lead. The council voted 7-5 in favor of Thorn's motion to establish the advisory body with immediate effect. Rowan had rejected the vote. He had invoked the Alpha's supreme authority, the ancient right of the bloodline to override council decisions in matters of territorial security. It was a power that had not been used in over a century, a nuclear option that every Alpha knew existed but that none had dared to trigger because the political cost was annihilation. Thorn had been waiting for exactly that response. Within hours of Rowan's invocation, Thorn's allies in the minor clans had declared the Alpha in violation of the territorial charter. 3 border clans had withdrawn their loyalty. The Eastern delegation had recalled its representatives. Commander Draven, reading the shifting landscape with the instincts of a career survivor, had positioned himself with the council majority and dissolved the Alpha's personal guard, replacing them with wolves who answered to the new advisory body. Rowan was trapped. He was still technically the Alpha King, still held the bloodline authority, still sat on the throne. But the throne was surrounded. The walls of power that had protected him for years had been quietly removed, one by one, and now he sat in the open, visible, exposed, a king with a crown and no kingdom. "Where is he now?" Celine asked. "Confined to the royal quarters, not officially under arrest. Thorn is too smart for that. Arresting the Alpha would trigger the loyalty instinct in every bloodline wolf in the territory. So they call it protection. They say he is being protected while the council handles the transition. There are guards on every door. His communications are monitored. He is alone. And Lara? Brennan's face twisted. The expression cost him, pulled at his cracked lips and the raw skin of his frost-damaged cheeks. She's at Thorne's side now. She dropped the pretense the moment the council vote passed. She sits in the advisory sessions. She speaks with Thorne's authority. She is the one who ordered the communications lockdown on the royal quarters. Celine stood. She walked to the window of the outpost and looked out at the frozen landscape. The world beyond the glass was white and gray and utterly still. The kind of stillness that comes when the temperature drops so low that even the wind stops moving, as if the air itself has frozen solid. She thought about Rowan in the royal quarters, alone, surrounded by guards who used to answer to him, sleeping in rooms where every wall had ears, eating food brought by hands he could not trust, breathing air that belonged to people who wanted him gone. She thought about what it felt like to be trapped inside a structure you built with your own hands and realized that the structure had been redesigned around you without your knowledge. Every wall moved, every door rekeyed, every hallway redirected so that no matter which way you walked, you ended up in the same small room. She knew that feeling. She had lived inside it for 7 years and called it love. The difference was that she had walked out. Rowan could not. She turned from the window. Nara was standing in the doorway, arms crossed, face unreadable. She had heard everything. "How many wolves can you commit?" Celine asked. "To what?" "To going south." Nara did not blink. "You want to extract him." "I want to give him a choice. He can stay in that room and wait for Thorne to find a legal mechanism to strip the bloodline authority, which will happen within weeks. Or he can come north, regroup, and fight." "With what?" "He has no army. His guard is dissolved. His allies have scattered. He has the bloodline. Every wolf born under the Alpha system carries the instinct to follow the true bloodline holder. Thorne can manipulate politics. He can buy loyalty with money and promises. But he cannot manufacture the thing that makes 10,000 wolves turn their heads when the Alpha walks into a room. That is in the blood. And Rowan still has it. Blood is not strategy, Celine. No, but it is the foundation strategy stands on. Without it, Thorne's entire construction is built on air. He knows that. That is why he has not killed Rowan. He needs the bloodline authority to transfer legitimately, through abdication or a charter mechanism. If Rowan dies under suspicious circumstances, the instinct triggers in every bloodline wolf across the Empire, and Thorne faces a revolt he cannot control. Nara considered this. Celine could see the calculations running behind those pale eyes, the weighing of risks and resources and political consequences. 30 wolves, Nara said. Enough for an extraction team, not enough for a fight. I do not need enough for a fight. I need enough for a door. A door. One way in, one way out. We get Rowan out of the fortress and bring him north. Once he is here, we use the intelligence I have decoded to expose the Voss network. We go public with everything. The cipher, the messages, Lyra's true allegiance, the plans for the Ashenmere mines. We give it to every clan leader, every elder, every minor house in the Empire. Let them see what Thorne is actually serving. And if Rowan refuses to come? The question hung in the air between them, and Celine heard it not as a strategic query, but as the question it really was. The question underneath all the planning and intelligence and tactical calculations. Will he trust you? After everything. After the tower and the silence and the cloak on the floor and the 300 miles of frozen wilderness between you. Will he look at you and see the woman who is trying to save his kingdom? Or will he see the woman he failed and feel nothing but the need to keep failing, because acknowledging what he did would require becoming someone he does not know how to be? If he refuses, Celine said, then I save the kingdom without him. The extraction plan took 4 days to build and 2 days to rehearse. Nara's 30 wolves were not soldiers in the traditional sense. They were intelligence operatives, scouts, trackers, wolves who specialized in moving through territory without being detected. They were not built for frontal assault. They were built for the kind of work that happened in the spaces between surveillance and sleep. In the 2-hour window when the guard rotation was thinnest, in the blind spot of the watchtower where the lamplight did not quite reach, Celine designed the operation herself. She used everything she knew about the Vale Fortress, every corridor, every hidden passage, every structural weakness in a building she had lived inside for 7 years. She knew which walls were thin enough to hear through. She knew which doors had faulty locks that could be forced without sound. She knew the timing of the guard shifts because she had designed the guard shift system herself 5 years ago, as part of a security overhaul she had implemented after an assassination attempt on Rowan during the Western campaign. She was now using her own security system against itself. The irony was not lost on her. Nothing was lost on her anymore. Loss was something she had graduated from. They moved south on the 7th day. 30 wolves and Celine, traveling light, traveling fast, covering ground in a way that left no tracks and made no sound. They avoided the main routes. They moved through the old growth forest, through terrain so dense and difficult that no patrol would think to watch it. They crossed the boundary into Vale territory on the 9th night and reached the outskirts of the fortress settlement by the 11th dawn. Celine stood in the tree line, 200 yards from the outer wall of the fortress she had called home for 7 years, and she looked at it the way you look at the face of someone you once loved who has become unrecognizable. The banners were different. Thorn's sigil hung beside the Vale crest on the main gatehouse, a visual declaration of shared authority that would have been unthinkable a month ago. The guard positions had been reorganized. The watchtower pattern was wrong, adjusted by someone who did not understand the sightlines the way Celine did. That was their way in. The adjusted watchtower rotation left a 90-second window on the northwest approach where the wall was unobserved. 90 seconds. Enough time for a team of 8 to scale the wall using the maintenance handholds that had been carved into the stone for the repair crews. Handholds that were not on any official schematic because they had been added informally over decades by workers who found the official access routes inconvenient. Celine knew about them because she had spent a week on the wall 3 years ago, personally inspecting the fortifications after a storm damaged the upper ramparts, and she had cataloged every unofficial access point because that was what she did. She noticed things. She remembered things. She built the mental architecture of her world with obsessive, exhaustive precision because precision was the only defense against chaos. They went in at 3 in the morning. 8 wolves, Celine leading, silent as smoke, scaling the northwest wall in 67 seconds and dropping into the narrow service corridor that ran between the outer wall and the inner courtyard. The corridor was dark, unlit, used only by maintenance crews during daylight hours. Celine moved through it from memory, counting steps, marking turns, navigating the darkness without hesitation because she had walked this path 100 times, and her body knew it the way her lungs knew how to breathe. They reached the royal wing in 12 minutes. 2 guards at the entrance. Nara's wolves neutralized them without sound. A choreography of controlled violence so efficient it was almost gentle. The guards slumped against the wall, unconscious, breathing steadily. They would wake in an hour with headaches and no memory of the last 30 seconds of their consciousness. Celine stood before the door to the royal quarters, the same door she had walked through thousands of times. The same iron handle, the same grain in the wood, the same slight unevenness in the stone threshold where the foundation had settled over the centuries. She opened the door. The room was dark. A single candle burned on the table by the window, its flame guttering in the draft from the open door. The furniture had been rearranged, the personal items removed. It looked like a cell disguised as a bedroom, clean, adequate, stripped of anything that made it a place where a specific person lived, rather than a space where a body was stored. Rowan sat in a chair by the window. He was not sleeping. He was staring at the candle flame with the fixed, unseeing gaze of a man who had spent too many hours alone with his own thoughts and had arrived at a destination inside his own mind that offered no exits. He had lost weight. She could see it in his face, in the sharpened angles of his jaw and cheekbones, in the way his shirt hung on shoulders that had always filled every garment to its limits. His eyes, when they finally moved from the candle to the door, were the eyes of a wolf that had been caged long enough to forget what open ground felt like. He saw her. Something happened in his face that she would never be able to adequately describe. It was not recognition. He had never failed to recognize her. It was something beyond recognition, something that lived in the territory past language, past thought, past the civilized architecture of the mind. It was the wolf. The pure, undiluted animal underneath the king and the strategist and the politician and the man who had failed her in every way a man could fail a woman. The wolf saw her, and the wolf made a sound.
Not a word. A sound. Low, broken, involuntary. The sound of something that had been holding itself together by pure will and had just been given permission to stop. "Get up," Celine said. He stared at her. The candle flame moved between them. "You have 90 minutes before the next guard rotation. We are leaving this fortress. You can come with me, or you can stay in this chair and wait for Thorn to finish what he started. Choose now." "How did you get in?" "I built the security system, Rowan. I know every flaw in it because I put half of them there on purpose so that if this exact situation ever arose, I would have a way in. I did not trust the world enough to leave myself without options. I never have." He closed his eyes. When he opened them, they were wet, and Celine watched him fight that moisture with every ounce of will he possessed, watched him refuse to let it fall because kings did not weep, alphas did not break, and the performance of strength was the last thing he had left. "Celine, do not say what you are about to say. There is no time for it, and I do not want to hear it. Not now. Maybe not ever. What happened in that tower, and what happened in the months before it, and what happened in the years before that, is a conversation for a world where we are not both about to die if we do not move in the next 3 minutes. So stand up, follow me, and do exactly what I tell you." He stood. He was unsteady, the physical deterioration of weeks of confinement and stress and whatever the guards had been putting in his food visible in the way he braced himself against the chair before trusting his legs. But he stood, and he looked at her across the dark room, and whatever was in his eyes was too large and too complicated and too laced with grief and gratitude and shame to survive translation into language. "I read your message," he said. "The intelligence about Lyra, about Voss, and you showed it to her." His jaw tightened. "Yes, I know. I thought she was. I know what you thought, and I know why you thought it, and that is why this happened, because you were alone. Because you had been alone for a long time, longer than you knew, and when someone finally stood close enough to fill the space, you did not ask who they were or why they were there. You just let them stand. The words were not kind. They were not meant to be, but they were not cruel either. They were true. And truth between two people who had destroyed each other was the only material strong enough to build anything on. "We are moving," Celine said. "Stay behind me. Do not speak." They moved through the fortress like ghosts. Celine led, Rowan followed, and Nara's wolves formed a silent perimeter around them, clearing corridors, neutralizing guards, opening and closing doors with a precision that turned the extraction into something almost mechanical. They retraced Celine's entry route through the service corridor, scaled the northwest wall in the watchtower blind spot, and dropped into the tree line outside the fortress, just as the eastern sky began to lighten with the first gray suggestion of dawn. They ran. Not the disciplined, paced movement of a military withdrawal. They ran with the desperate animal urgency of wolves fleeing a territory that was no longer theirs, crashing through undergrowth, leaping frozen streams, pushing north through the forest with every molecule of speed their bodies could produce. Behind them, the fortress began to wake. Celine heard the first alarm horn sound when they were a mile out, a long, mournful blast that echoed off the mountain and sent birds screaming from the pines. They crossed the Vale boundary at mid-morning. They kept running. The northern wilderness swallowed them the way it swallowed everything, with cold, indifferent completeness. They stopped to rest in the shelter of a rock formation 12 miles north of the boundary. Nara's wolves established a defensive perimeter. Celine sat against a boulder and breathed, great heaving breaths that burned in her lungs and tasted of pine and ice and adrenaline. Her body was trembling. Not from cold this time. From the release of a tension she had been holding for weeks, a coiled spring in her center that had just been allowed to unwind. Rowan sat across from her. They looked at each other across 6 feet of frozen ground, and neither spoke, because what could be said between two people in this position, between a woman who had risked everything to save a man who had destroyed her, and a man who understood finally and completely that the destruction he had caused was not an event but a landscape, vast and barren and stretching in every direction with no visible end. Then Celine reached into her pack and pulled out the decoded Voss messages and held them out to him. "Read these. All of them. When you are finished, you will know what I know. About Lyra. About Thorn. About the Voss network and what they want.
And then we will decide what happens next, together. Not because I forgive you, not because I trust you, because the thing that is coming is bigger than what happened between us, and I refuse to let it win." He took the papers. Their fingers touched in the transfer, and both of them flinched, a small, shared involuntary reaction that said more about what remained between them than any confession or apology could have articulated. Rowan began to read. And 50 miles to the south, in the fortress he had just escaped, Lyra stood in the council chamber with Thorn and received the report of the Alpha King's extraction. She listened. She did not react. When the report was finished, she turned to Thorn and spoke in a voice that carried no emotion whatsoever, a voice engineered for precision the way a scalpel is engineered for cutting. "Activate the Ashen Mirror protocol. All of it. No more phases. No more timelines." Thorn stared at her. "That was not the plan. We are months ahead of." "The plan changed when she decoded our communications. Celine Ashford has the cipher key. She has the network structure. She has 6 months of operational intelligence. Everything we built in the dark, she has dragged into the light. So we stop hiding. We stop maneuvering. We take the mines. We take the territories. We take everything. Now. The clans will resist. Then the clans will burn." The candle on the council table guttered and went out. Lyra did not relight it. She did not need to. The darkness suited what was coming. And in the frozen wilderness, crouched over the decoded papers with hands that shook from cold and something far worse than cold, Rowan Vale read the truth about the woman he had trusted with his kingdom and his heart, and he felt something inside him that was not the wolf and not the king and not the man, but something older than all three of them, something that understood, with a clarity that left no room for negotiation or self-deception or the comfortable lies he had been telling himself for years, that the world he knew was already gone. The question was not whether he could save it. The question was whether the thing he would have to become in order to fight what was coming was something he could live inside afterward, or whether the price of survival would be the annihilation of everything he had once believed himself to be. The wind picked up. The temperature dropped. The sky darkened. And 300 miles to the south, the first fires began to burn in the Ashen Mirror Range. The fires in the Ashen Mirror Range burned for 6 days. Celine saw the glow from the Harrowfield outpost on the second night, a faint orange stain on the southern horizon that pulsed like something alive, like the slow heartbeat of a creature too large and too old to die quickly. The smoke reached them by the third day, drifting north on winds that should have been too cold to carry it that far. It settled into everything. The food tasted of it. The water carried its residue. When Celine wiped her face in the morning, the cloth came away gray. She was standing at the outpost window when Rowan finished reading the last of the decoded Voss messages. She heard him set the papers down. She heard the creak of the chair as he leaned back. She heard his breathing, measured and controlled, the breathing of a man who had trained himself to regulate his body under extreme stress because losing control of the breath was the first step toward losing control of everything. "The mines," he said. "Yes, they are burning the mines. Not burning, clearing. They are using fire to drive out the wolves who work the deep shafts. The miners, the engineers, the families who live in the Ashenmere settlements. Voss does not want to destroy the ore. They want to control the extraction without interference." "How many families in the settlements?" 1,200, maybe more. The winter population swells when the mountain passes close, and the seasonal workers cannot return to the lowlands. Rowan was quiet for a long time. Celine did not turn from the window. She let the silence do what silence always did between them. It filled the spaces where words were too expensive and too imprecise. It held the weight that language could not lift. "I did this," Rowan said. It was not a question. She did not treat it as one. "You did not start the fire. You did not build the Voss network. You did not design the conspiracy. I opened the door. I let her in. I showed her your intelligence. Every move Thorn has made in the last month was enabled by decisions I made because I trusted the wrong person. Yes, you could have let me rot in that room." Celine finally turned from the window. She looked at him across the small space. He sat in the wooden chair with the decoded papers spread on the table before him, and the firelight from the hearth threw shadows across his face that made him look older, harder, stripped down to the structural elements beneath the surface. The king was gone. The commander was gone. The man who had stood on the pinnacle and hesitated before his oath was gone. What remained was something she had never seen before, Or perhaps something she had always seen but never allowed herself to recognize. The raw material. The unfinished thing beneath all the layers of authority and performance and self-deception. Exposed, ugly, real. "I could have," she said. "I thought about it." "Why did you not?" "Because 1,200 people are burning in the Ashenmere Range, and they do not care about our personal catastrophe. Because the Voss network will not stop at the mines or the Vale Kingdom or any single territory. Because whatever I feel about what you did to me is a private matter, and this stopped being private the moment Lara activated the Ashenmere protocol." Rowan looked at his hands, large hands, scarred hands, hands that had built a kingdom and signed treaties and held weapons, and touched a woman who was designed to destroy him while the woman who had saved him stood 3 floors below, wearing a ceremonial cloak and waiting for an oath he was too fractured to deliver. "Tell me what you need me to do." "I need you to stop being the Alpha King." His eyes came up. The wolf stirred behind them, reflexive, territorial, the ancient instinct that heard a challenge in every sentence and responded with the need to dominate. She watched him fight it, watched the muscles in his jaw work, watched his hands close and open and close again. "Explain." The Alpha system is what Voss exploited, the centralized authority, the single point of failure. They studied you for years. They mapped your psychology. They engineered a woman to fill the exact gaps in your emotional architecture. They did all of this because the Alpha model makes it possible. One man at the top, one mind making every decision, one throat to cut. It is not a governance system. It is a vulnerability masquerading as tradition. You are asking me to dismantle everything my bloodline built. I'm asking you to recognize that what your bloodline built is a cage, and you have been sitting inside it for so long you think the bars are walls, and the walls are the world. The minor clans did not rebel because Thorn whispered to them. Thorn's whispers worked because the grievances were real. The clans are tired of kneeling. They are tired of a system that concentrates every decision in one man's hands and then blames them when that man makes decisions that serve himself. You want to fight Voss? Fine. Fight them. But you cannot fight a network that operates across the entire empire with a system designed to concentrate power in a single fortress. You need the clans. All of them. And they will not fight for a king. They will fight for something they have a stake in. Something that belongs to them. A council. Not Thorn's council. Not an advisory body designed to strip authority and redistribute it to the same old bloodlines who have been hoarding power for centuries. Something new. Something that gives the minor clans, the border packs, the settlement wolves, the people who actually live in this empire and do the work of keeping it alive, a voice that cannot be silenced by one man's decree. Rowan stood. The chair scraped back on the stone floor. He walked to the window where she had been standing and looked south, toward the orange glow on the horizon, toward the kingdom that was burning because of choices he had made and choices he had failed to make, and the vast, unforgiving mathematics of consequences. If I do this, if I give up the centralized authority, there is no going back. There was never any going back. That is the thing about doors, Rowan. Some of them only open in one direction. He pressed his forehead against the cold glass of the window. His breath fogged the surface. She watched him stand there, and she felt something shift between them. Not reconciliation, not forgiveness, nothing so clean or simple. It was the recognition that they were standing on the same ground for the first time in years. Not as lovers, not as king and consort, as two people who saw the same crisis and understood that the only way through it required both of them and neither of them intact. "I need to speak to Nara," he said. "She is expecting you." He turned from the window and walked toward the door. As he passed Celine, he stopped. They stood 18 inches apart, and she could smell him, the specific combination of sweat and fatigue and the sharp metallic undertone of fear that she had learned to identify during years of standing beside him in situations where death was closer than the next breath. He smelled the same. After everything, after the betrayal and the exile and the coded messages and the midnight extraction and the 300 miles of frozen wilderness, he smelled exactly the same as the man she had loved for 7 years. Her body remembered him. Her mind did not forgive him. The two facts coexisted without resolution, like two wolves sharing a cage, each one waiting for the other to look away first. He did not touch her.
He walked past and out the door and down the corridor to where Nara waited. The alliance was forged in 48 hours. Nara committed the full resources of the Harrowfield Pack. Messages went out through her intelligence network to every contact, every sympathetic clan leader, every minor house that had been chafing under Vale centralization for decades. The message was simple, and it was devastating. The Alpha King renounces sole authority. A new territorial charter will be drafted. Every clan will have a seat. Every voice will carry weight. And the immediate, urgent, non-negotiable priority is the defense of the Ashenmere Range and the 1,200 wolves trapped in the burning settlements. The response was not unanimous. Nothing involving wolves ever was. 3 clans refused outright, suspicious of a trap, unwilling to believe that a bloodline alpha would voluntarily surrender power. 2 clans sent conditional messages demanding specific guarantees before committing resources. But 7 clans responded within the first day. 7 clans, including 2 that had withdrawn their loyalty from Rowan during Thorn's coup, sent word that they were mobilizing. Not for the Alpha King. For the promise that the Alpha King was willing to become something else. Among those 7 responses was one from a source Celine did not expect. The rogue packs of the Northern Mountains. 300 wolves who had lived outside the territorial system for generations, exiles and outcasts, and the descendants of wolves who had chosen the wilderness over submission. They sent a single-line message through Nara's courier network. It read, "We fight for the settlements, not for the crown. Show us the difference, and we march." The army assembled at the Harrowfield border in 11 days. It was not a proper army. It was a coalition, a ragged, mismatched, deeply suspicious collection of wolves from territories that had spent decades distrusting each other. They came in groups of 20, 50, 100. They came armed with whatever they had. The clan warriors brought forged steel in organized formations. The rogue pack wolves brought hunting bows and an intimate knowledge of mountain terrain that no traditional military training could replicate. The settlement volunteers brought axes and picks, and the particular terrifying determination of people who had nothing to lose because everything they had was already on fire. Celine organized them. Not Rowan. Not Nara. Celine. She stood in the center of the Harrowfield staging ground in borrowed traveling clothes with her hair tied back and her ceremonial knife on her hip and the decoded Voss intelligence committed to memory, and she organized a fighting force out of raw chaos because that was what she had always done. She had built supply chains in the war camps when the professional quartermasters had given up. She had coordinated troop movements across 3 fronts while Rowan made the speeches and took the credit and never once asked how the food appeared on time or the weapons arrived sharpened or the wounded were evacuated before the next assault. She did it again now. Not for him, not for the kingdom, for the 1,200 wolves in the Ashenmere settlements who were dying while armies argued about politics. On the 12th day, they marched south. The route Celine planned avoided the main approaches to the Ashenmere Range. Those routes would be watched. Lyra was too competent, too strategic, too deeply embedded in the Voss operational playbook to leave the obvious paths unmonitored. Instead, Celine took the coalition through the old trade routes she had identified weeks earlier, the ones running through the northern mountains that had been closed after the border wars. The rogue pack wolves knew these routes like they knew their own heartbeat. They led the column through passes that did not appear on any map, through tunnels carved by ancient water flows, through gaps in the mountain walls so narrow that the wolves had to move single file, pressed against the rock, with the wind screaming overhead like a blade being drawn across a whetstone. They reached the Ashenmere Range in 8 days. The fires had been partially contained by the time they arrived, not by firefighting efforts, but by the simple exhaustion of available fuel. The lower forests were gone, reduced to charred trunks and ash-covered ground that crumbled underfoot. The settlements on the eastern slope were destroyed, stone foundations and chimney stacks jutting from the wreckage like broken teeth. The smell was indescribable, not just smoke and burned wood, but the underneath smell, the one that soldiers recognized and civilians did not. The sweet, heavy, unmistakable smell of organic material that had been reduced to its base elements by extreme heat. Celine stood at the edge of what had been the largest Ashenmere settlement and looked at the destruction and felt something inside her go very still. Not grief. Not yet. Grief required processing time, and there was no time.
What she felt was the absolute crystalline focus that came when the noise of emotion was stripped away and only the essential remained. The settlement was gone. The people who had lived here were either dead or scattered or hiding in the deep mine shafts where the fire could not follow. The mission had not changed. Find the survivors, secure the mines, and deal with whatever Voss forces were occupying the range. They found the survivors first. 300 wolves, mostly women, children, and elderly, huddled in the ventilation caverns of the deepest mine shaft, breathing air that was thick with smoke and fear. They had been underground for 9 days. Some of the children had not seen sunlight in over a week. Their eyes, when they emerged into the gray daylight of the ash-covered range, were enormous, dilated, adjusting to a brightness they had forgotten existed. Rowan was the first to reach the entrance of the mine shaft. Celine watched him from 30 feet away as the survivors came out in a slow, stumbling line, blinking, coughing, holding on to each other. She watched a child, a girl of maybe 6 or 7 with ash in her hair and burns on her small hands, look up at Rowan and recognize him. The girl did not speak. She did not need to. Her face said everything. It said, "You are the Alpha King. You are supposed to protect us. Where were you?" Rowan knelt in the ash. He knelt in front of the child, and he said nothing, and she said nothing, and the silence between them was louder than the fires had been. Celine saw his hands tremble. She saw his throat work. She saw the mask crack and the real thing underneath its surface. Not the wolf, not the king, not the man who had built an empire and lost it through his own blindness. Just a person, just a human being confronted with the consequences of his failures, in the form of a burned child who had waited 9 days in the dark for someone to come. He reached out and took the girl's damaged hands in his own, very gently, the way you hold something that might break, and his head bowed and his shoulders shook once, just once, and then he stood and turned to Celine with a face that had been remade. "Where are they?" he said. His voice was a thing she had never heard before. Not anger, not command. Something past both of those. Something that had been forged in the last 30 seconds and would never be unforged. Voss has a force of approximately 200 occupying the primary mine entrance on the western face. Mercenaries mostly. Exile territory wolves supplemented by what our scouts believe is a core cadre of Voss operatives. They have been extracting ore since the fires cleared the settlements. Wagon convoys have been moving south toward the Vale territory border. How many wagons? 12 that our scouts have counted. Heavy loads. They are stripping the mine as fast as they can. They know we are coming. They are trying to take everything they can before we arrive. They know we are coming, and they have not retreated. No. Why? Because they are not just extracting ore. The mine entrance they are holding is the deepest shaft in the range. It goes down further than any other access point. Whatever Voss wants from the ore, whatever research they have been pursuing, the answer is in that shaft. They will fight for it. Rowan looked at the coalition force assembled behind them. 1,100 wolves, give or take, against 200. The numbers favored them. But numbers did not account for defensive positions, for the choke point of a mine entrance carved into a mountain face, for the fact that the Voss mercenaries had been here for days and had certainly fortified their position, while the coalition had just completed an 8-day forced march through mountain terrain that had left every wolf exhausted and half of them limping. "We cannot assault the mine entrance directly," Celine said. "The approach is a killing ground. 300 yards of open, burned terrain with no cover, rising toward a fortified position. We would lose half our force before we reached the entrance." "You have a different approach." "The mine has 17 ventilation shafts. I know because I oversaw the geological survey when the deep expansion was approved 4 years ago. 14 of those shafts are too narrow for a wolf to pass through. 3 are not. You want to send teams through the ventilation shafts. I want to send one team through one shaft, the one on the northeastern face. It is the widest, it is the furthest from the occupied entrance, and it connects to the deep tunnels 300 feet below the main shaft. A small team, no more than 15, can enter through the ventilation shaft, move through the deep tunnels, and emerge behind the Voss defensive line inside the mine. At the same time, the main force begins a visible approach on the western face. Not a full assault, a demonstration. Enough pressure to keep the mercenaries focused forward while the tunnel team moves into position behind them. And then? Then we close the trap. The tunnel team hits them from behind. The main force pushes forward. 200 mercenaries caught between two forces in a confined space with nowhere to run. Rowan studied the terrain. She could see him working through the plan, testing it against his own experience, looking for the flaws she might have missed. This was the thing that had made them effective together. Not love, not loyalty, not the bond the ceremonies celebrated. This, the ability to think in tandem, to build strategy the way two hands build a structure, each one doing what the other could not. Who leads the tunnel team? He asked. I do. No. This is not a negotiation. I know the mine layout. I oversaw the survey. I have been through the ventilation shafts personally. None of your wolves have. None of Nara's scouts have. I am the only person in this coalition who can navigate those tunnels in the dark without getting lost. And getting lost in the deep shafts means dying in the deep shafts. So I lead the team. If something goes wrong down there, if the shaft has been damaged by the fires, or the Voss forces have sealed the tunnels, you will be trapped underground with 15 wolves and no way out. I am aware of the risks. I am not willing to accept them. Celine looked at him. The ash-covered ground between them, the burned horizon behind him, the child with the damaged hands being carried away by a Harrowfield medic, the 1,100 wolves waiting for a plan that would either save the Ashenmere range or end in a slaughter that would break the coalition before it had accomplished anything. You do not get to decide what risks I accept. Not anymore. Not ever again. You lost that right in a tower room on the night of the Moonfire ceremony, and you do not get it back by kneeling in front of a burned child and feeling sorry. You get it back by trusting my judgment in the field the way I trusted yours for 7 years. I told you to stop being the Alpha King. This is what that looks like. It looks like letting someone else lead when they are better suited for the mission. It looks like standing in the open and drawing fire, while the person who actually knows the terrain does the work that wins the battle. Can you do that? The question hung in the air. Around them, the coalition wolves moved and organized and prepared, the low hum of 1,000 bodies in motion, checking weapons, adjusting armor, speaking to each other in the short, clipped sentences of people who knew that some of them would not be speaking by tomorrow. I can do that, Rowan said. The assault began at dawn. The main force moved first. Rowan led them, visible, deliberate, walking at the front of the column across the burned terrain toward the western mine entrance, with the ash rising around his boots in small gray clouds. He wore no ceremonial armor. He wore the same traveling clothes he had been wearing since the extraction from the fortress, stained and torn and utterly without the trappings of royalty. He carried a sword borrowed from a Harrowfield armory and a shield that had seen better decades. He looked like what he was, a man walking toward a fight he might not survive, leading wolves who did not trust him yet but were willing to follow because the alternative was watching the Ashenmere range fall to an enemy that would not stop at the mines. The Voss mercenaries saw them coming. Celine, already underground, already moving through the ventilation shaft, with 15 wolves behind her in a single-file line that inched through darkness so complete it pressed against the eyes like a physical weight, felt the vibration through the rock when the first volley of arrows hit the approaching column. The mountain carried sound differently underground. It compressed it, amplified it. The distant impact of projectiles on shields and armor reached her as a rhythmic percussion, muffled but insistent, like the heartbeat of the mountain itself. The ventilation shaft was tight, tighter than she remembered. 4 years of geological settling and the heat from the fires had shifted the rock in subtle ways, narrowing passages that had once accommodated her body with inches to spare. Now she squeezed through gaps that scraped her shoulders and compressed her ribs and made breathing feel like trying to inflate her lungs inside a fist. The wolves behind her moved in silence, trusting her, following the sound of her movement because they could see nothing. Because down here, 300 feet below the surface, light was a memory, and sound was the only map. She counted her steps. She measured the turns. She tracked the slight changes in air pressure that indicated intersections, open chambers, dead ends. The mine layout was stored in her mind with the same obsessive precision she applied to everything. 4 years ago, she had walked these tunnels with an engineer named Holt, a quiet, methodical wolf who had spent his life studying the Ashenmere geology and who had explained every feature of the deep shafts with the patient enthusiasm of someone who loved the rock the way other people loved their children. Holt had shown her the ventilation system, the drainage channels, the ore veins that ran through the deep stone like arteries through a body. He had told her that the mountain was alive. Not alive in the metaphorical sense that poets used, alive in the geological sense. It moved, it shifted, it breathed through its shafts and sweated through its walls, and occasionally, when the pressure built beyond what the rock could contain, it screamed. She thought about Holt now, in the dark, with the walls pressing close and the sound of battle vibrating through the stone above her. She wondered if he was among the survivors they had pulled from the caverns. She wondered if he was among the dead. She did not allow the wondering to distract her. She filed it in the same compartment where she kept everything that hurt, the locked room inside her mind that she would open when the mission was complete and the luxury of feeling was once again affordable. The tunnel opened. The deep shaft intersection was exactly where her memory placed it. A chamber roughly 30 feet in diameter, carved by water millennia ago and expanded by miners in the last century. 3 tunnels branched from it. She took the leftmost. It climbed at a gentle angle, following the ore vein that Holt had called the Mother Lode, the densest concentration of silver ore in the entire range. This was what Voss wanted. This was what the fires and the mercenaries and the entire conspiracy had been designed to secure. She could hear them now. Above and ahead, the sounds of the Voss force filtered down through the rock. Shouted commands, the clang of weapons, the heavy thud of something being dragged across stone, wagons or crates, or equipment being repositioned. They were focused forward, on the main force approaching from the west. They did not know that 15 wolves were moving through the mountain behind them like blood through a vein, silent, inevitable, converging on the heart of their operation. The tunnel ended at a wooden door. Not a natural formation, a constructed barrier installed by the miners to seal the deep shafts from the primary excavation areas. Celine pressed her hand against the wood and felt the vibration of activity on the other side. Close. Very close. The door was the last barrier between the tunnel team and the interior of the mine. She turned to the wolf behind her. She could not see his face. She placed her hand on his shoulder and squeezed once, the tactical signal they had established before entering the shaft. Ready. He passed it back. 15 wolves in a chain of touch and pressure, communicating without sound, preparing for the transition from darkness to violence. Celine gripped the handle of the door. Her hand was steady. Her breathing was controlled. Her heartbeat was elevated but manageable, the disciplined cadence of a body that had been through enough combat to know the difference between fear and readiness. Fear paralyzed, readiness clarified. She was as clear as she had ever been. She pulled the door. The light hit her like a fist. After an hour in absolute darkness, even the dim lamplight of the mine interior was blinding, and she moved through the blindness on instinct, trusting her body to cover the ground her eyes could not yet see. The first Voss mercenary she encountered was facing the wrong direction, watching the mine entrance where the main force was pressing its attack. He turned at the sound of the door. He turned too late. Celine's knife found the gap between his armor and his shoulder, and he went down without a sound, and she was past him before he hit the ground. The tunnel team poured through the door behind her. 15 wolves erupting into the mine interior with the compressed fury of an hour spent in darkness and silence, and the suffocating intimacy of rock walls close enough to touch on both sides. They hit the mercenary rear line like a wave hitting a seawall, and the formation that had held against Rowan's frontal approach fractured in an instant. The disciplined line breaking as 200 wolves realized simultaneously that the killing blow was coming from the direction they had not been watching. Celine moved through the chaos with the precision of someone who had spent 7 years studying the anatomy of combat and understood that fights were not won by the strongest or the fastest, but by the wolf who maintained coherent thought while everyone around them was drowning in adrenaline and noise. She directed the tunnel team into the gaps in the mercenary line, exploiting the confusion, keeping the pressure constant, never allowing the Voss fighters time to regroup or reorganize. She was not the strongest fighter on the field. She never had been. But she was the one who saw the entire board, who tracked every movement, who understood where the next crisis would erupt before it happened, and positioned the right wolf in the right place to meet it. The main force broke through the mine entrance 4 minutes after the tunnel team engaged. Rowan came through first, because of course he did. Because the man could not help leading from the front, even when leading from the front was tactically idiotic. He came through with his borrowed sword in his hand and blood on his face from a cut above his left eye, and an expression that Celine recognized from the border wars, the expression of a wolf who had found the fight he had been looking for and intended to finish it or be finished by it. The mine interior became a crucible, two forces colliding in a confined space, the echoes of steel and screams amplified by the rock walls until the sound was a physical assault, a pressure that pushed against the eardrums and rattled the teeth. The lamplight swung on its chains overhead, throwing wild shadows that made every figure look like 10, turning the battle into a nightmare of movement and confusion and the animal certainty that survival was a matter of seconds. Each second a separate negotiation between the will to live and the mathematics of being surrounded by people trying to end that life. Celine found Lyra in the deep shaft, not by chance, by design. While the battle raged in the main excavation chamber, Celine had tracked the movement patterns of the Voss operatives, the core cadre that fought differently from the mercenaries, with more discipline, more coordination, more evidence of a shared training system. They were falling back, not retreating, repositioning, moving toward the deep shaft entrance with a purpose that had nothing to do with the battle and everything to do with whatever Voss had been doing in the deepest levels of the mine. She followed them, alone. The tunnel team was engaged in the main chamber. Rowan and the coalition force were grinding through the mercenary resistance. No one saw her leave. No one saw her descend the carved stone steps into the deep shaft, moving by memory, moving by the map in her head that Holt had given her 4 years ago, without knowing he was giving her the key to something that would matter more than either of them could have imagined. The deep shaft was quiet. The sounds of battle above were muffled by 100 feet of rock. The air was different here, colder, denser, carrying a faint metallic tang that Celine recognized as the scent of concentrated silver ore. The walls glowed. Not with lamplight. With the ore itself, the same strange inner luminescence that the silver monument on the pinnacle possessed, but stronger here, closer to the source, unfiltered by processing or distance. The walls of the deep shaft pulsed with a light that seemed to come from inside the mountain, from someplace beyond the physical structure of the rock, as if the stone was a skin and the light was the blood beneath it. Lyra stood at the far end of the shaft, in front of a wall of exposed ore that glowed so brightly it cast shadows. She was not alone. 2 Voss operatives flanked her, armed, alert, watching the shaft entrance with the focused attention of wolves guarding something they valued more than their own lives. Behind her, against the ore wall, a series of instruments Celine did not recognize. Metal frames, glass containers, tools of measurement and extraction that belonged to no mining operation she had ever seen. Research equipment. Whatever Voss had been studying about the silver ore, this was where the study happened. Lyra saw her and did not move. She stood in the glow of the ore wall with the same patient, certain expression she had worn on the pinnacle the night of the ceremony, the expression of someone who had been expecting this, who had, in fact, been counting on it. "You decoded the messages," Lyra said. "All of them. Then you know this is bigger than a kingdom. I know you burned 1,200 people out of their homes to dig metal out of a mountain. The ore is not metal. It never was. The first wolves who found it 300 years ago did not understand what they had. They made monuments and ceremony trinkets out of a material that has properties beyond anything your empire's primitive understanding can comprehend. Voss has spent decades studying it. We are close to something that will change the fundamental nature of what wolves are and what wolves can become. Thrones and territories and the petty wars of bloodline kings are irrelevant beside what this ore represents. Irrelevant. You used that word to describe 1,200 lives. I use that word to describe a political system that keeps an entire species trapped in a cycle of dominance and submission and calls it tradition. You of all people should understand that, Celine. You have been fighting that system your entire life. You just did not know what you were fighting for. I know exactly what I am fighting for, and it is not this." Celine looked at the 2 Voss operatives. They were watching her with the flat, assessing eyes of professionals calculating threat levels and response options. She looked at the knife in her own hand, still wet from the battle above. She looked at Lyra, standing in the glow of the ore wall with the absolute conviction of someone who believed their cause justified any cost. And she heard it, from above, from the main chamber. A sound that cut through the rock and the silence and the distance like a blade through water. A howl. Not a battle cry, not a signal. A howl of alarm, of shock, of something gone catastrophically wrong. The sound carried a name. Rowan. Celine's blood went cold. Not metaphorically. She felt the temperature of her body change, felt the heat drain from her extremities as every ounce of blood rushed to her core, her heart hammering, her vision narrowing to a tunnel that contained only the shaft entrance and the stone steps leading up, and the knowledge that something had happened in the battle above that was going to change everything again. She looked at Lyra. Lyra was smiling, not broadly, not triumphantly, a small, precise smile that contained more information than 1,000 decoded messages. "You should go," Lyra said. "The contingency was always the alpha. Remove the bloodline, remove the symbol. The clans have nothing left to rally behind." Celine ran. She took the stone steps 3 at a time, her boots slamming against the carved rock, her breath tearing in and out of her lungs, the knife in her hand forgotten. Everything forgotten except the sound of that howl and the name it carried, and the terrible, nauseating understanding that Lyra had planned for this. The battle, the tunnel assault, the confrontation in the deep shaft, all of it was a stage direction, a choreography designed to put Celine underground at exactly the moment when the real strike happened above. She burst into the main excavation chamber, and the first thing she saw was blood, not the scattered blood of combat, a pool, spreading across the stone floor of the mine in a dark, reflective sheet that caught the swinging lamplight and turned it crimson. Coalition wolves were gathered in a tight circle, their faces white, their weapons lowered, their bodies forming a wall around something on the ground that Celine could not see and did not need to see because she already knew. She pushed through the circle. Rowan lay on the mine floor with a blade buried in his side, just below the ribs, angled upward in the precise trajectory of someone who knew exactly where to place steel to cause maximum damage with minimum effort. The blood was everywhere. His hands were pressed against the wound, his fingers dark and slick, and his face had the gray, translucent quality of a body that was losing volume faster than the heart could compensate. His eyes found hers. In the swinging lamplight, in the blood and the chaos and the echoing screams of a battle that had not yet ended. His eyes found hers the way they always had, across rooms and battlefields and the vast, aching distance of everything they had broken between them. His lips moved. She knelt beside him and put her ear close to his mouth and heard him say, in a voice that was barely a vibration in the air, 3 words. Draven. It was Draven. She looked up. Across the chamber, Commander Draven stood with a bloody blade in his hand and the expression of a man who had just completed a task he had been assigned a very long time ago. Not Thorn's man. Never Thorn's man. Voss. From the beginning. The wolf who had arranged Lyra's quarters in the royal wing. The wolf who had dissolved the Alpha's personal guard. The wolf who had been standing beside Rowan for 6 years, close enough to touch, close enough to kill, waiting for the moment when the killing would accomplish what years of manipulation could not. Draven met Celine's eyes across the blood-soaked floor of the mine. He did not run. He did not speak. He simply stood there, with the blade dripping, and waited. And Celine knelt in the blood of the man she had loved and hated and saved and could not save. And the battle raged around them, and the ore walls glowed with their ancient, indifferent light. And somewhere deep below, Lyra was already moving through escape tunnels that Voss had carved months ago, carrying research and samples and the knowledge of what the silver ore truly was. And the blood moon rose over the Ashenmere range, red and enormous, painting the ash-covered landscape in a light that looked exactly like what it was, the color of an ending. And a beginning so terrible that no one standing in that mine, not the coalition wolves, not the mercenaries, not the burned survivors huddled in the caverns below, not Celine with her hands pressed against the wound in Rowan's side and his blood running through her fingers like time itself, could have predicted what it would cost them to see it through. Celine's hands would not stop the blood. She pressed harder. She pressed with everything she had, with the full force of her body weight bearing down through her palms against the wound in Rowan's side. And the blood came anyway, dark and steady, flowing between her fingers and pooling beneath him on the cold stone floor of the mine. It had a temperature. That was the thing no one told you about trying to keep someone alive with your hands. The blood was warm, warmer than the air, warmer than the stone, and as it left his body, it carried his heat with it, and she could feel him cooling beneath her palms, the fundamental warmth of a living body draining away in a current. She could not stop any more than she could stop a river with her bare hands. "Stay with me," she said. His eyes were open but unfocused. The gray translucence of his skin had deepened. His lips were the color of the ash outside. His breathing came in shallow, uneven pulls, each one a negotiation between the body's need for air and the body's inability to fuel the mechanics of breathing when the system that delivered oxygen to muscle was leaking onto a mine floor. "Draven," Rowan said again. The word was barely formed. A shape made of air and will and nothing else. Celine looked up. Across the chamber, the battle had shifted. The coalition wolves, galvanized by the sight of their alpha bleeding on the ground, had driven the remaining Voss mercenaries into the narrow passage near the mine entrance. The fighting there was brutal, compressed, the kind of close-quarters violence that left no room for strategy and reduced combat to its most primitive equation: who wanted to survive more. The mercenaries were breaking. She could see it in their formation, the way the line bent and buckled, the way individual fighters began glancing over their shoulders, looking for exits, the instinct to flee overriding the discipline to hold. Draven had not moved. He stood 30 feet away with the bloody blade still in his hand and the expression of a man who had crossed a line so final that the territory on the other side held neither fear nor regret. He watched Celine kneeling in Rowan's blood, and his face showed nothing, not triumph, not guilt. The absolute emptiness of someone who had been playing a role so long that when the role ended there was nothing underneath. "Someone get a medic down here," Celine shouted. Her voice cracked on the words. She did not care. Now! 2 Harrowfield wolves broke from the perimeter and ran for the shaft entrance. Nara's field medics were positioned with the main force above. Getting them down here would take minutes. Celine did not know if Rowan had minutes. She looked down at him. His eyes had found her face and were holding on to it the way a drowning man holds on to a piece of wreckage, not with strength, with the last reflexive contraction of fingers that have forgotten how to let go. "The deep shaft," he whispered. "Lyra. She is gone. She had escape tunnels prepared. She is already moving south. The ore. We have the mine. The research equipment is still in the deep shaft. Whatever Voss was doing down there, we will find it." His hand moved, slowly, with the immense effort of a body that had lost too much blood to perform casual actions. His hand moved from the wound and found hers. His fingers wrapped around her wrist. They were slick with blood, his and hers indistinguishable now, mixed on the stone floor and on their skin and in the spaces between their intertwined hands. "I'm sorry," he said. "Do not do that. Celine, do not apologize to me while you are bleeding to death on a mine floor. That is not courage. That is convenience. You apologize when you are standing on your own 2 feet and looking me in the eye, and it costs you something, not when you think you are dying and the words come cheap." Something moved in his face, not quite a smile, the ghost of something that in another context, in another life, might have been admiration. "Still fighting," he said. "I have never stopped. You just were not paying attention." The medics arrived. 2 of them, carrying field kits, dropping to their knees beside Rowan with the efficient urgency of wolves trained to treat battlefield wounds. Celine moved aside. She had to force her hands to release the wound. Her fingers had locked into position, the muscles cramped from sustained pressure, and when she finally peeled them away, the impression of his body remained in her palms like a mold, a negative space where the warmth of him had been. She stood. Her legs trembled. Her entire body trembled. She was covered in blood from the chest down, her borrowed clothes saturated, her hands stained to the wrists. She looked at her hands and felt something break loose inside her, a structural failure in the internal architecture she had built to hold herself together through the extraction, through the march, through the battle, through the long weeks of intelligence work and planning, and the relentless, exhausting discipline of not feeling what she felt, because feeling it would have made her incapable of doing what needed to be done. The feeling broke loose and she let it pass through her the way a river passes through a canyon. It carved. It eroded. It reshaped the landscape of her interior in ways she could not control and did not try to. She stood in the mine with her bloody hands at her sides and let the grief and the rage and the love and the 7 years of accumulated cost washed through her, and she did not fall. That was the only victory she claimed for herself in that moment. She did not fall. Across the chamber, Draven moved. He dropped the blade. It rang against the stone, a single clear note that cut through the noise of the dying battle. He sank to his knees, not in surrender. In the simple physical collapse of a body that had been carrying a secret for 6 years and had finally set it down. 3 coalition wolves converged on him. They bound his hands. They pulled him to his feet. He did not resist. He walked between them toward the mine entrance, and as he passed the place where Rowan lay with the medics working on his wound, Draven looked down. One look. Brief and unreadable and heavy with the weight of everything that had led to this moment. Every shared campaign. Every battle fought side by side. Every night in the command tent where 2 men who were supposed to be brothers in arms had sat across from each other, and one of them had been calculating when to drive the blade in. Then Draven was gone, escorted into the gray daylight of the ash-covered range, and Celine never saw his face again. The medics stabilized Rowan. The blade had missed the vital organs by centimeters, a margin so narrow it was less like luck and more like the universe making a point about the difference between the end of a story and the continuation of one. The blood loss was severe, the wound was deep, but the medics packed it and compressed it and stopped the bleeding and administered field treatments that would keep him alive long enough to reach proper care. And Celine stood over them and watched and felt the iron bands around her chest loosen by increments so small they were almost imperceptible. He would live. The knowledge did not bring relief. It brought something more complex, more textured, harder to name. It brought the understanding that everything that happened from this point forward would require both of them to become people they did not yet know how to be. Surviving the wound was the easy part. The body healed. The body had mechanisms for repair, cells that divided, tissue that regrew, blood that replenished. The body forgave damage with the blind, relentless optimism of a system designed for recovery. The rest of them would have to learn forgiveness from scratch, without the body's mechanical advantage. The battle ended. The Voss mercenaries who survived surrendered. The coalition secured the mine, the deep shaft, the research equipment Lyra had left behind. Nara's intelligence wolves began cataloging everything in the deep shaft, the instruments, the samples, the documents that Voss had not had time to destroy. Celine would review it all later. Not now. Now she stood at the mine entrance and looked out at the Ashenmere range under the blood moon and breathed air that tasted of ash and iron and the particular, unmistakable flavor of aftermath. War had a flavor. She had learned that years ago. It tasted like metal and smoke and the faint organic sweetness of bodies pushed past their limits. It tasted like the gap between what you planned and what actually happened. It tasted like survival, which was never as clean as the word suggested. The days that followed were slow and dense and filled with the unglamorous work of rebuilding something from wreckage. The Ashenmere survivors were brought out of the deep caverns and housed in temporary shelters constructed from salvaged materials. Food was distributed. The wounded were treated. The dead were counted and named and mourned in the private, wordless way that wolves mourned, which was not with ceremony or speeches, but with silence. Long, communal silence that stretched across the camp like a blanket, heavy and warm and smelling of grief. Celine organized most of it. She organized it because she always had, because the organizational work of survival was the thing she knew how to do when everything else was shattered, because giving her mind a logistical problem to solve was the only way to keep it from turning inward and devouring itself. Rowan healed slowly. The medics kept him in a makeshift infirmary in the mine's upper chambers, where the air was dry and the temperature stable and the ore walls cast a faint, constant glow that made the room look like the inside of a pearl. Celine checked on him once a day. She reviewed his medical reports with the field medics. She confirmed that his condition was improving, that the wound was closing, that the blood was replenishing. She did this with clinical efficiency, the way a commanding officer checks on a key asset, because treating it as anything more personal than that would have opened a door she was not ready to walk through. On the 9th day after the battle, Rowan stood up. He stood on his own. The medics protested. He ignored them. He walked out of the infirmary on legs that shook but held, and he walked through the mine and out the entrance and stood on the ash-covered ground of the Ashenmere range in the thin winter sunlight and breathed the outside air for the first time in over a week. Celine was 50 yards away supervising the construction of a supply shelter when she saw him emerge. She stopped what she was doing. She watched him stand in the daylight, squinting against the brightness, one hand pressed against his bandaged side, his face gaunt and pale and marked with the particular vulnerability of a body that has been badly damaged and knows it. He looked old, not in years, in something else, in the accumulation of consequence, in the visible evidence of a man who had been taken apart by his own choices and put back together by the hands of a woman he had not deserved, and who understood, with a clarity that was written in every line of his face and every careful movement of his damaged body, that the man who had been taken apart was not the same man who had been reassembled. He saw her watching him. He raised one hand, not a wave, not a greeting, a recognition, an acknowledgement that she was there and he was there, and the distance between them was both 50 yards of ash-covered ground and 7 years of accumulated damage, and he did not know how to cross either one. She did not go to him. Not then. Not yet. 3 weeks after this battle, the clan leaders arrived at the Ashenmere Range for the assembly that Selene and Nara had organized. They came from every territory in the Wolf Empire. Major clans, minor houses, border packs, settlement collectives, and the rogue wolves of the northern mountains who had fought in the battle and earned a seat at any table that was being built. They came because the messages that had gone out after the battle were unlike any communication the Wolf Empire had ever received. They did not come from the Alpha King. They did not come from a council or a bloodline authority. They came from a coalition signed by Nara of Harrowfield and Selene Ashford and 23 other wolves representing the forces that had retaken the Ashenmere Range. And they invited every clan to participate in the drafting of a new territorial charter. Not an order, an invitation. The distinction mattered more than any sword or bloodline. The assembly was held in the largest surviving structure in the Ashenmere settlement, a stone building that had once served as the Miners' Guild Hall. It was scarred by fire, its roof partially collapsed, its walls blackened with soot. Selene had considered finding a more impressive venue, but had decided against it. The Guild Hall told the truth. It showed the damage. It said, "This is where we are. This is what was done. Now decide what you will build on top of it." 70 wolves gathered in the Guild Hall on the first morning. Clan leaders, elders, representatives of the minor houses. They sat on salvaged benches and overturned crates and pieces of stone hauled from the rubble. There were no thrones. There were no elevated platforms. Everyone sat at the same level, and the symbolism was as deliberate as every other choice Selene had made in the last 2 months. Rowan was there. He sat near the back. He did not sit at the front. He did not stand. He did not project authority or demand attention or do any of the things that Alpha Kings had done for 300 years when entering a room full of wolves who were supposed to kneel. He sat on a wooden crate with his bandaged side pressed against the wall for support, and he watched and he listened. Selene stood. She did not stand at the front of the room. She stood in the center, surrounded by wolves on all sides, visible from every angle, exposed in the way that people are exposed when they have nothing left to hide behind and have decided that hiding is no longer an option. "You know who I am," she said. "Most of you know what I did for the Vale Kingdom. Some of you know what was done to me. None of that matters today. What matters is what you have seen in the last month. An Alpha King manipulated by a network that has been operating inside your territories for decades. A council corrupted from within. Settlements burned, wolves killed, and an ore that lies beneath these mountains that someone decided was worth more than the lives of the people who lived above it." She paused. The room was silent. 70 wolves, many of whom had spent their lives competing and distrusting each other, sat in the ruins of a burned building and listened to a woman who had no title, no bloodline, no formal authority, and no reason to be standing in the center of a room full of clan leaders except that she was the one who had decoded the conspiracy, organized the coalition, planned the assault, and kept the Alpha King alive long enough to be in the room at all. The system that allowed this to happen is the same system we have been told is sacred. One Alpha, one bloodline, one voice making decisions for every wolf in the territory. We were told this system protected us. We were told it was tradition. We were told it was the only way wolves could govern themselves without tearing each other apart. And for 300 years we believed it. We believed it because the alternative was uncertainty. And wolves fear uncertainty more than they fear tyranny. She looked around the room. She found Nara sitting near the eastern wall with her arms crossed and her pale gray eyes tracking every reaction in the room. She found the rogue pack leader, a weathered wolf named Kale, who had lost 2 fighters in the mine battle and who sat with the rigid posture of a man deciding whether the words being spoken were worth the blood his wolves had shed. She found the Harrowfield elders, the minor clan representatives, the settlement volunteers who had fought with axes and picks alongside trained warriors. I'm not asking you to abandon tradition. I'm asking you to look at what tradition cost us and decide if the price is acceptable. An alpha king who could be isolated and manipulated because the system concentrated all authority in one mind. A council that could be corrupted because accountability flowed upward to one throne instead of outward to the people it governed. Settlements that burned because the wolves who lived in them had no voice in the decisions that determined their safety.
These are not failures of individuals. Rowan Vale failed. Aldrich Thorne betrayed. Commander Draven drove the blade. But they were able to do what they did because the system was designed to make their failures catastrophic. One point of failure. One throat to cut. One mind to poison.
What are you proposing? Kale said. His voice was rough, the voice of a wolf who had lived outside the system his entire life and had earned the right to be skeptical of anyone claiming to reform it. A territorial council with binding authority, not Thorne's version, which was designed to concentrate power in the old bloodlines under a different name. A council where every clan, every settlement, every pack, regardless of size or bloodline or history, holds a seat and a vote. Major decisions require a majority. Military action requires a supermajority. No single wolf, no matter what blood runs in their veins, can commit the resources and the lives of the Empire without the consent of the wolves whose resources and lives are being committed. Peace. And the Alpha? The Alpha remains. The bloodline authority is real. It is felt by every wolf in this room, whether they admit it or not. It is the thing that makes 10,000 wolves turn their heads when the true holder walks into a space. That power exists. Denying it would be as foolish as concentrating all governance inside it. The Alpha leads. The Alpha speaks for the Empire in matters that require a single voice, but the Alpha governs within boundaries set by the Council. Not above the Council. Within it. 70 wolves sat in the ruins of the guild hall and absorbed this. Celine watched the reactions move through the room the way weather moves across a landscape. Skepticism, interest, fear, hope. The particular guarded expression of wolves who had been lied to so many times by so many powerful voices that the sound of truth had become unfamiliar, and they needed time to recognize it. Rowan stood. The room shifted. Every eye moved to him. The instinct was involuntary, bred into the blood, the automatic response of wolves to the presence of the bloodline holder. He felt it happen. Celine could see him feel it, the weight of 10,000 years of genetic programming pulling every wolf in the room toward his center of gravity. And she saw him do something she had never seen an alpha do. He stepped back. He physically stepped back, away from the center, away from the focal point of the room's attention, a deliberate, visible act of repositioning that said more than any speech could have communicated. He was not abdicating. He was not diminishing himself. He was making room. What she described is not what I was raised to build, he said. His voice was quieter than the room expected. The alpha voice, the one that commanded and compelled, was absent. In its place was something rawer, less polished, carrying the rough edges of a man who was speaking without the mask for the first time in his life. I was raised to believe that the Alpha was the kingdom, that my blood was the foundation and my will was the law, and that any challenge to that structure was a threat to be eliminated. I believed it because it was all I knew, and because believing it made me powerful, and power felt like safety, and safety felt like enough. He paused. His hand moved unconsciously to his bandaged side. The wound that Draven had given him. The wound that marked the exact spot where 6 years of misplaced trust had been repaid. It was not enough. It was never enough. The power I held did not protect the wolves in the Ashenmere settlements. It did not prevent the corruption of my council. It did not stop a woman engineered by enemies from walking into my home and reshaping my decisions for months. And it did not keep me from destroying the one person who saw all of this coming and tried to warn me, a person I failed in ways that I will spend the rest of my life understanding. He did not look at Celine when he said this. He looked at the room. He looked at the wolves who had fought and bled and lost people in the mine battle. He looked at the rogue pack leader and the minor clan representatives and the settlement volunteers who had swung axes beside trained warriors because no one else was going to save their families. I am not asking you to trust me. I have not earned that. I am telling you that the woman standing in this room built the systems that held my kingdom together for 7 years, and I took credit for her work and called it my legacy. I am telling you that when the kingdom collapsed, she was the one who decoded the conspiracy, assembled the coalition, planned the assault, and walked through a mine shaft in total darkness to end the occupation. I am telling you that the voice you should be listening to is not mine. It has not been mine for a long time. I was just too blinded by the weight of my own crown to see it. He sat down. The crate creaked under him. The room was silent. Celine looked at him across the guild hall. He was looking at the floor. His hands were in his lap, one pressed against the bandaged wound, the other resting on his knee, palm up, empty. She saw the emptiness. She understood it. It was the emptiness of a man who had set something down that he had been carrying his entire life, and did not yet know what his hands were for without it. The assembly lasted 6 days. The drafting of the new charter was contentious, complicated, messy, in the way that all genuine governance is messy when the people being governed actually have a voice. Clans argued. Representatives walked out and came back. Compromises were reached and then unraveled and then renegotiated. Celine mediated most of it, not because she was appointed to, but because she was the only person in the room who understood both the political machinery of the old system and the practical requirements of the new one. She understood because she had built half of the old system's operational infrastructure and had spent the last 2 months imagining what a better one might look like. The charter was signed on the 7th day. 70 wolves put their marks on a document that restructured the governance of the wolf empire for the first time in 300 years. The alpha bloodline was preserved. The territorial council was established. The old codes that had allowed Thorn to exploit procedural mechanisms for personal power were replaced with frameworks that distributed authority across the clans while maintaining the cohesion necessary for an empire spanning thousands of square miles of territory. It was not perfect. Celine knew it was not perfect. No governance system was. But it was honest, and it was built by the wolves who would live under it, and that made it stronger than any system imposed from above by a single bloodline, no matter how ancient. After the signing, the clan leaders departed. The Ashenmere Range emptied slowly as the coalition forces returned to their territories, carrying copies of the charter, carrying stories of the battle, carrying the memory of what they had done and what it meant. The rogue pack wolves disappeared into the northern mountains with a formality Celine respected. Kale shook her hand before leaving, his grip rough and brief, and said one sentence, "You kept your word." Then he was gone. Nara stayed an extra day. She and Celine stood on the ridge above the destroyed settlement as the sun set over the Ashenmere Range, painting the ash-covered landscape in shades of amber and gold that made the devastation look almost beautiful, the way destruction sometimes does when the light catches it at the right angle. "You could lead this," Nara said. "The council, the new system. Every wolf in that assembly would follow you." "I do not want them to follow me. That is the entire point." "I know. That is why they would." Celine smiled. It was a small smile, tight at the corners, shaped by exhaustion and something else, something that might have been the first fragile filament of peace she had felt in months. "Go home, Nara. Rebuild your border defenses. The Voss network is damaged, but not destroyed. Lyra is still out there. The research she took from the deep shaft is still in their hands. This is not over." "It is never over. That is the first lesson of governance. You do not win. You maintain." "Then we maintain." Nara extended her hand. Celine took it. They stood on the ridge with their hands clasped, two women who had found each other across the wreckage of an empire and built something that neither of them could have built alone. And the handshake lasted 3 seconds and contained more trust than either of them had placed in another living being in years. Then Nara walked down the ridge and gathered her wolves and headed north, and Celine stood alone on the high ground and watched her go and felt the wind change direction and carry the last of the smoke south, away from the mountains, away from the settlements, away from the mine where wolves had bled and died and fought for something that was still too new and too fragile to have a name. She found Rowan at dusk. He was sitting on a stone wall at the edge of the destroyed settlement, looking at the Ashenmere range as the last light faded from the peaks. The bandage on his side was visible beneath his shirt. He had lost weight during the recovery, and the gauntness gave his face a quality she had not seen before, a kind of transparency, as if the layers of performance and authority and self-deception had been stripped away by the wound, and what remained was closer to the actual surface of the man than anything she had seen in 7 years. She sat beside him on the stone wall. Not close, not far. The distance of two people who had been through something that language could not contain and who understood that the silence between them was not emptiness, but architecture. It was the space where something new might be built, if they chose to build it, and if they had the patience to build it correctly. The Thornwood clan signed the charter, she said. That was the last holdout. I heard. Your speech in the guild hall, the part about taking credit for my work. Every word of it was true. I know. That is why it worked. They sat in the fading light. The wind moved across the ash-covered ground and carried the fine gray particles in low, swirling patterns that looked like ghosts, like the outlines of the buildings and the lives that had existed here before the fires. I do not know who I am without the crown, Rowan said. I have been thinking about it since the assembly. Every morning I wake up and reach for the weight of it, the authority, the certainty, the thing that told me who I was and what I was supposed to do. And it is not there. And the absence feels like falling. It is not falling. It is standing. You have been propped up by a system your entire life. Standing on your own feels like falling because you have never done it before. How long does it take? I do not know. I have been standing on my own since I was 17. I am still learning. He turned to look at her. The last light caught his eyes and she saw them clearly, without the mask, without the performance, without the careful management of expression that Alpha Kings learned before they learned to walk. She saw the man, not the king, not the wolf, not the commander or the politician or the lover who had failed her. The man, scared, exhausted, uncertain, trying. Can you forgive me? He asked. She considered the question with the same thoroughness she applied to everything. She turned it over. She examined it from every angle. She tested it for hidden assumptions and structural weaknesses and the subtle ways that words could be used to extract something from another person without offering anything in return. Forgiveness is not a door, she said. It is not something you walk through once and then you are on the other side. It is a practice. It is something you do every day, over and over, and some days you can do it and some days you cannot. And the person who hurt you does not get to decide which day is which. I understand. No, you do not. Not yet. But you might, eventually, if you stop trying to understand it with the part of your brain that solves problems and start trying to understand it with the part that sits in the dark and does not know the answer and is willing to stay there anyway. He was quiet for a long time. The darkness settled. The stars appeared, cold and distant and indifferent to the affairs of wolves and kingdoms, and the slow, painful process by which two people who had destroyed each other attempted to find a way to exist in the same world without further destruction.